Thanks. And then do we have someone doing the, Abby, are you doing the moving people in to the room?
Everybody should be able to get in just normally now.
Okay. Seeing folks come into the space, welcome. Give people a couple minutes to make their way in. But see Patrick, Aaron, Corey, Ivy, hello. Tucker. So thanks folks for joining. We'll give another minute for people to make their way in and we'll get going. Still getting used to WebEx myself, trying to figure out how I can see the most people, but I think we got a pretty good amount of advisory group members here, so I'll just welcome us. We'll bring folks into the space as they join. So welcome, Oregon Department of Energy Strategy Advisory Group meeting number 3. Hopefully y'all are in the right space. So appreciate, it's good to see folks once again. I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping and then I'll pass it to Edith to kick us off before we do our introductions with each other. So if we go to the next slide, just want to give a brief primer on using WebEx, and I'll ask my Department of Energy colleagues if I miss anything, but a couple critical pieces. You have on the bottom right your raised hand option. So as we have our conversation, you have the raised hand, you have the audio. Also on the bottom of your screen, you got the mute button on the bottom left. You can stop and start video. Of course, we always encourage folks to stay on video, both to try to create the feeling of being in a group together, but also for our audience and the public. We do have reactions made. I would just ask you to be mindful of your reactions. They don't always mean the same thing to everyone, but certainly if you want to give a thumbs up with things that you agree with, it's a way to help emphasize and give show some love to what you might hear from others. And then we do have the chat function. I'll just ask folks, to maintain a level of chat etiquette. One of the things we used to say in the old days, no side conversations, chat in a virtual environment can replicate that. So just be mindful, please, as you use your chat, and we're not trying to have long conversations. I'd also, I think in chat, if you click on it, to make sure that your chat is set to everyone, to make sure that both folks around the table, but also audience can see those functions. Odo, anything that you would add around WebEx? Okay, there's probably some other features that we'll discover together. There is a zoom in, zoom out button on the top if you're ever wanting to see slides more clearly. So feel free, of course, during this conversation, if you use the chat, if you're having technical difficulties, you can reach out to either Abby or Gilly, who are on our team that can help you navigate some of the technical issues. So with that, Edith, I'm going to pass it to you.
Thanks, Ben, and hi, everybody. It's great to see you again. And I'm sorry to have missed the last meeting, but I have watched the recording and heard all of your comments and the great discussion in that meeting. So I just wanted to make a note. I know that others are listening to this meeting from outside of the advisory group, and I wanted to let you know that although the time has passed for submitting comments on the reference scenario, Odo's comment portal is open for general questions or comments, and it's going to remain open throughout the duration of the project. And we welcome your insights, questions, and suggestions. I just thought that was important to make clear that that portal itself hasn't closed. So if we go to the next slide, please. Before I jump into the meeting objectives for today, I just wanted to provide responses to some process questions and just speak to a little bit of the follow-up from our last meeting. So there's a question about the number of public attendees at the working groups. Each working group meeting had between 5 to 10 public attendees joining. And by public attendees, I mean folks who weren't members of the working group, but who listened into the conversation. I also wanted to point out that advisory group members can get more information on the modeling in your packets in the materials that we sent around over the last couple of weeks. So you received the reference scenario in your meeting materials, which are all posted online, and we can post the location there in the chat, just in case anybody wants to have that at their fingertips and don't have it right now. I also wanted to just point out that the working group invite list has been posted to the website, and I'll ask someone from the team to also paste the location for that in here. We had all of that information, but it was separate, and we had the comment that it was a little bit difficult to navigate and to find that list. So that's all in one place now. And finally, I wanted to thank everyone for your perspectives and the really robust and important discussion on the charter in our last meeting. We sent around the updated charter to everyone, as well as a memo that was summarizing the changes that we made and how those reflect the discussions that we had in the meeting. And we're happy to hear any comments that you have on that. And I just wanted to also point out that hopefully you've all had a chance to review that and that we sent that out. So I wanted to shift gears now and focus us in on today. So we have talked about the role of this group in providing insights, advice, and recommendations throughout the energy strategy development process. And we talked about the role of this group in both kind of the early stage of developing analysis and materials, and in more advanced stages throughout the project. And so today we're in one of those advanced stages in terms of defining the key assumptions that will go into the reference scenario and the modeling of the reference scenario. So the reference scenario will serve as the starting point for the analysis of pathways to meeting our state's energy policy objectives. And so it's really important. And the first objective is really to ensure that we have a shared understanding of what that is. Second, we shared with you the presentation from the last working group meeting and the kind of a link to the PowerPoint, and we encouraged you all to watch the recording of that meeting for those who weren't able to join at the time. And then we provided, as I've mentioned, the draft reference scenario document online. And we'd like to provide today some space for you to share your reflections, your comments, your concerns on the draft reference scenario. Third, we have some specific questions where either there's a range of perspectives that we've heard kind of in both directions, or we feel that we haven't received sufficient feedback and that we'd benefit from another round of opportunity for folks to comment in a live forum. So we'd like to put these questions to you for discussion, and we'll get to that after a little bit before the break and then after the break. And finally, we'd like to dive a bit into the emerging what-if scenarios, the emerging alternative scenarios, and where our thinking is on that. And so that, I would say, is sort of a less advanced stage. So for the reference, we're getting pretty close, and for the alternative scenarios, we're a little earlier in defining those. So if we go to the next slide. So this is the agenda we've sent out. And as I suggested in the email that I sent, we really want this to be a working session where we're really focusing on that draft reference scenario. So we're going to try to really focus in our time that we're speaking and provide as much time as possible for you to provide feedback. So what we will do in the first part of the working session is to run through changes that have happened since the last working group, just to highlight some of the changes that we're suggesting, why we're suggesting them, what we heard through the kind of comment and feedback period that has led us to adjust our thinking. And we then propose to hear your thoughts, your general thoughts on the reference scenario, have an open discussion, and then we'll move to some of these specific questions that we have for you. And I've already mentioned that we'll talk about the alternative scenarios, and then I want to make sure that we talk about upcoming meetings too, to give a bit of a preview on what we're planning to focus on, and to talk a little bit about scheduling and maybe even the possibility of doing something in person. So that's the agenda. And Ben, I think I'm going to pass it back to you now to talk a little bit about our group agreements today.
Great, thanks, Ida. So I won't spend a lot of time on here. I'll just highlight a few key principles for group agreements. So one, as Edith just walked through, we've really been thoughtful and intentional about our agenda. So really sticking to the topics and honoring kind of how we're trying to move through the different discussion points and spaces that you all can serve your role as advisory group members in the best way possible. And some of the ways to do that is to listen to each other. Again, really seeking to learn and understand, be curious. We can debate, but, I just ask folks, listen to understand, not just to respond, to be constructive in your comments, to be open-minded and really try to explore not just what you're hearing from the agency, but what you're hearing from each other. Again, asking clarifying questions. We have a few spaces where those are intentionally built in, space for clarity and ensuring that you all have a common grounding and foundational understanding of where we're going and why. To be open and accountable to yourself, to each other. Act with respect, right? Resolve differences. We say this every time, right? To the extent that this group finds common grounds and speaks collectively as one voice, that's really powerful for Department of Energy, for Oregon Department of Energy as we move the work forward. And then, share the space, right? So, part of my job as facilitator is both to ensure that we're hearing from you all, but, I'll encourage folks that tend to be the first to raise their hand every time to take a moment, take a breath, step back. And for those of you who tend not to jump into the conversations, really encourage you to create that space for yourself and add that expertise and wisdom to the group. And then for the chat, again, I'll just remind folks that we will put resources in the chat. There'll be times where additional questions that the agency can answer can go in the chat, but what we don't want is kind of deliberation and debate back and forth in the chat that can be really distracting, both for us as a group and for those in the audience. So I'll just ask for folks accountability and agreement around how we create and cultivate that space. And if we go to the next slide, we'll introduce ourselves, welcome ourselves to each other. So I'll just kind of go in the order alphabetically by first name and have you introduce your name and affiliation, organization, et cetera, that you might represent. So we're going to start with the two A's. Aaron Orlovsky.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Aaron Orlovsky, and I am with the Eugene Water and Electric Board. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. Andrea.
Hi, I'm Andrea Kreiner. I'm the Executive Director of the Oregon Association of Conservation Districts and the former Director of the Energy Office in Delaware.
Thank you, Andrea. I don't see Andrew Malky, are you here? Let's see you on there. Brian Adams.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Brian Adams, representing the Pacific Propane Gas Association and the current president and CEO of Conergy Propane, headquartered here in Oregon.
Good. Thank you, Brian. Charity?
I'm Charity Fain, Executive Director at Community Project.
Thanks, Charity. You're a little quiet. Kathy, I don't see Kathy. I think I skipped Kathy. Don't see Kathy. Christine Golightly?
Hi, sorry. Christine Golightly, Policy Analyst with the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission.
Thank you. Corey?
Good morning. Corey Scott. I'm with Pacific Power.
thank you. Emily Griffith?
Hi, everyone. I'm Emily Griffith. I'm the Oregon Policy Manager for Renewable Northwest. Thanks.
Good, thank you. Aaron Childs?
Aaron Childs, Executive Director, Renewable Hydrogen Alliance.
Okay. Fred? Saw you out there, Fred. But if you're talking to us,
Yeah,
up
hi there, everybody. It's Fred Hewitt, Northwest Energy Coalition. Good morning.
morning, thank you. Ivy?
Morning, everyone. This is Ivy Quach with QB Fabrication and Welding.
Okay, and then Jeffrey, not seeing Jeffrey, Jen Bees?
Morning, everyone. Jen Bees, Director of Environmental with the Port of Portland.
Thank you. Jennifer Hillhart?
Good morning. This is Jennifer Hillhart with the Oregon Citizens Utility Board.
Thank you, Jennifer. Jimmy Lindsay?
Good morning. Jimmy Lindsay with Portland General Electric.
Thank you, Jimmy. Joshua?
Good morning. Babasapin Solutions.
Good, thank you. Juan?
Good morning. Juan Barraza with Latino Founders.
Thank you. Laura Tabor?
Laura Tabor, Climate Action Director with the Nature Conservancy in Oregon.
Thank you. Mary Merlins? See you. Yep. You're on mute though, Mary. What's that? Barry Merlin's Northwest Natural. Thank you. Michael Colgrove.
Good morning, everyone. It's Mike Colgrove with Energy Trust of Oregon.
Good, thank you. Nate Hill.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Nate Hill, Head of Energy Policy at Amazon Web Services.
Thank you. Patrick Mills.
Good morning, Patrick Mills. Work in the Office of the Executive Director for the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation.
Thank you. I don't see Rakesh. Are you out there? Don't see you. Robert Wallace. Let's see, Robert. I know Scott's. Well, Scott, I heard you were going to be late, but I see your name, Scott Sims.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Scott Sims, Public Power Council. Yeah, sorry, I'm a little bit late. Thanks.
Your perfect timing. Shannon Souza.
Good morning, Shannon Souza, Ocean and OSEA, Oregon Solar and Storage Industry Association.
Sorry, Souza. I'll get that right next time. Timothy McMahon. Tim.
Yeah, good morning. Tim McMahon with Stoll Reeves Law Firm, and I'm a siting and permitting attorney in Washington and Oregon.
All right, thanks, Tim. And then Tucker, I saw you out there somewhere. Tucker Bellman.
Yeah, thanks. Tucker Bellman with the Oregon Rural Electric Cooperative Association.
Great, thank you. Did I miss anybody that might have joined after I got through the part of the alphabet? Okay. And I'll just acknowledge we got a number of Oregon Department of Energy staff, some of our CETI colleagues, and just I'll have folks just introduce themselves as they present today. So Edith, I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks, Ben. And I have to say, I actually love that quick intro part where we all have a chance to introduce each other and remember who's in the room. So thanks for doing that. I'd like to just bring us all along to where we are in the process. You will have seen some of these slides, but I think it's important to remind everyone of how we've gotten to where we are today, where we are, and what comes next. So if we go to the next slide. As you're aware, since July 31st, we've held public listening sessions and a series of working group meetings. I should back up even before that and say that we started with a strong model developed by our consultants. It's a model that's been well tested in studies at national level. It's also the model that was used for Washington's state energy strategy. And so the focus in preparation for those working groups was really to meet with data holders to ensure that we kick off public engagement, having discussed existing energy and integrated resource plans, energy related studies and data analysis, which is something that the bill asks us to do. And we've been working really hard to make this model and the model inputs as Oregon specific as possible. And that's really been the focus of a lot of the preparation and then of these discussions in the listening sessions and the working group. The working groups, each of the working groups, going back to the timeline here, met at least 3 times. Once for a detailed overview of how the model works. That was a plenary meeting with all the working groups together. A second time to bring everyone into their specific topic area and to work through some specific key assumptions and areas for discussion in each working group's topic area, with a lot of overlap between the different groups, and a lot of interconnectedness between the different sectors. And then we had a final third meeting for everyone to run through topic by topic, working group by working group, what we'd heard and what we were proposing, and with really a focus on where we had taken on some of the comments that we'd heard and were considering some as to our starting point had been. 2 of the working groups met twice, land use and environmental justice and equity. Both of these are working groups that really cut across all of the other working group topics. So the second meeting was to really allow for an opportunity to feedback to the land use and the environmental justice and equity working group what the other working groups had discussed, and to get a little additional feedback based on that. Since each of the working group topics really has an influence on the interests of the land use working group and the environmental justice and equity group. Public comment closed last Wednesday. That was a few days later than our original deadline, but we provided a few extra days for comments to come in. And we have worked really hard to go over all of those comments that we received. Some of them came in quite late Wednesday night. And we took those on. I know we had a 5 p.m. deadline, but a few trickled in after that. And we're meeting with you today to help us finalize our thinking. So, this is kind of that additional opportunity that the advisory group has for discussion and feedback, as I said, kind of towards the very end of a key part of the analytical work going into the energy strategy. If we go to the next slide. Again, what you see here should be familiar to you. I know that Jessica shared this slide with you at our last advisory group meeting. It's our process, it represents our process up until now to inform the modeling. And on the left side, you can see the different ways that Odo collected input into the model. The steering group, again, is an interagency group. It's made up of peer agency experts who provide expertise, data, and guidance to ensure that the energy strategy is built on the foundations of existing policies and programs, and that we're understanding the details of how those are being implemented and how to take them into account. The working groups, of course, represent the interests of the different organizations and communities and serve as a conduit of information to and from the working group discussions themselves through their organizations and through their communities. And again, there were 8 topical working groups. The listening sessions and public comment portal have been there to enable broad public engagement and to provide an opportunity for anyone to provide feedback through the entire energy strategy development process. And as I've mentioned at the very beginning, we have an online portal that's going to be open throughout the process, although we will have some intermediate deadlines to help us understand public feedback and incorporate it in a timely way as we work through the analysis. You all, of course, are the advisory group, and we're meeting with you today just before we finalize the key assumptions that are going into the reference scenario. And we'll talk a little bit about the alternative scenarios today because there's a really important relationship between those. We've received a lot of good feedback, a lot of detailed feedback on preferred inputs for the reference scenario, on data sources to consider. And you can see some of these here in orange. And if we go to the next, it kind of brings us to where we are today. So we've produced this draft reference scenario at the last plenary working group meeting that was held on August 22nd. We highlighted the main changes, as I said, that we were considering for the reference scenario based on the feedback that we'd received, and we encouraged working groups to start working on their comments based on that presentation. We realized that this did not show the full picture. It didn't pull everything together. And so we put online a few days later a more complete set of data and assumptions for the reference scenario across sectors to allow people to kind of see it all in one place. And that was put up online on August 28th. And today we're here to present to you the updating modeling inputs based on that feedback that we received, and we want to get your comments and advice. And so the majority of our meeting today will focus on that. It'll focus on kind of providing an opportunity for final inputs, both kind of generally, we'll have kind of an open part of the discussion and we'll have specific questions for you. After today, we'll move into the kind of the teal circle that you see here to finalize all of the modeling inputs. And that's really important so that our modeler can start to actually do the work of the modeling and start running the model and making sure that everything is working. And that takes a bit of time. So one note on the final reference scenario is our modeler, Jeremy, programs the model, and as we work through the process to finalize the alternative scenarios, he may advise us to make some adjustments if something is just coming out looking weird or it seems that something isn't quite right. We'll make sure that we communicate any kind of material changes that pop up during that process. So if we go to the next slide, this is just to a reminder of some of the internal guidance that we've developed, some of the decision-making criteria that are guiding how some of these, I would say, small d decisions on inputs into the model are being made. And again, we showed this to you before. First, there are several ways that the model is structured that informs kind of the structure of how this exercise looks. First, the bill asks us to develop pathways to achieving our state energy policy objectives. That includes our greenhouse gas emissions goals. So that's just something that the model is going to solve for meeting those energy policy objectives. It also has the discipline of making sure that anything that comes out solves for energy system reliability. That's a key energy policy objective, in fact, and one that we take very seriously. And the model also works to incorporate existing laws and policies. And particularly, again, it solves for those anchor policies that set really ambitious targets out to 2040 and 2050 with some intermediate dates in there. I've added to this slide a point that I think is really important to just bring up to the top, which is that the reference case focuses on aggressive but achievable goals. So again, the bill asks us to model how we achieve our climate and energy goals. Those are indeed ambitious. And based on our overview of studies in the region and around the country, achieving that level of decarbonization will require aggressive but achievable levels of electrification, of energy efficiency, of load flexibility. We know also that there are really big risks and unknowns that we're facing here. And in many ways, we're in uncharted territory regarding the scope and scale of change needed to meet our energy and climate policy objectives. And for this reason, the modeling is really structured to test what changes when we don't meet some of those key levers in the reference scenario, if we don't electrify as rapidly or as broadly, or if we rely more on alternative fuels, or if transmission takes longer to build. And so it's really important to see this kind of reference case framing in the context of the alternative scenarios and the learnings that happen in between. And we'll talk about that in a moment. And then finally, we have really been focusing on making sure that we're using the best available data, the best quality data, and that we're really focusing on, while we're focusing on a time frame out to 2050, that the learnings that we can draw from this analysis inform near-term decisions and recommendations. If we go to the next slide, please. So that brings me to just kind of summarizing what the analysis does and doesn't do. So firstly, the analysis does what the bill asks us to do, developing pathways to achieving our energy policy objectives, understanding trade-offs. These policies cut across sectors. They cut across electricity, transportation, direct use fuels. It's an economy-wide analysis. And that's one of the benefits of what this model does. It integrates the electricity sector and fuel supply for this economy-wide perspective. This is a little different than what you might be used to in the IRP world, for example, or in some of the electricity planning or transmission planning that's happening. And it's one of the reasons that we see this as a complementary view to inform our thinking, in addition to the other work that's happening out there. We're also creating complementary analyses to look at co-benefits and costs of different pathways on equity, environmental justice, on land use. We'll be looking at job implications and the link between air quality and health. It's also important to just pause for a moment and talk about what the model does not do. First of all, we're not forecasting the future. We're modeling out to 2050 to understand what near-term decisions are needed to navigate uncertainty. This model does not serve the same purpose as utility IRP models. It's not a least cost planning tool to plan for specific investments over kind of a near and medium and longer term time frame. It's a mechanism to understand economy-wide decarbonization options and their implications to inform policy. And along these lines, the model does not focus on any single utility service territory. It looks at IOU service territories, it looks at COU service territories. And again, it's not just electricity, it looks at fuels and it's a statewide model. And this is also not a transmission planning model. There's a lot of great and in-depth work happening on transmission planning, and we're paying attention to all of that as well. And finally, we're not providing location-specific outputs or results for resources. So we won't be able to tell you exactly where something will be sited or if it'll be built in any particular part of Oregon. So I'm going to pass the mic now to Alan to talk a little bit more about the dynamics of the model and how it works. Alan, on to you.
Yeah, thanks, Edith. As Edith described, the purpose of the model and the analysis we're doing is very different than what some of you are used to in least cost planning or IRP processes. Purpose of our modeling is not to create a resource portfolio for cost recovery, but more to inform the recommendations of the Oregon State Energy Strategy. So we do that in a very specific way. Click, Jillian. By comparing a reference case to different potential future pathways that are all economy-wide, to see what we can learn and use to create our recommendations. And it will help us achieve our 3 energy policy objectives. So we start with this reference case. And we are not, as in IRP modeling, trying to nail down a future portfolio of resources. We're comparing different pathways or scenarios against the reference case. So the reference case, along with the scenarios, must achieve the 3 anchor energy policy objectives, HB 2021, the CPP, and then 80% target for the remainder of the economy from the Executive Order 20-04. So the starting point for all the model runs is that they must meet our 3 anchor energy policy objectives. The reference case creates a portfolio of resources and actions that complies with those 3 anchor objectives by using a sophisticated model that Edith has talked about, that Evolved has created. And it's been used and vetted in numerous other studies around the country, which is basically why we hired them. It does use a least cost planning model. And then along with, we input aggressive but achievable demand side inputs and other constraints like transmission to create the reference case pathway. So the model then cranks out financial benefits and co-benefits and cost of the reference case. So then we develop these 5 different scenarios or pathways that will compare back to the resource reference case. All the scenarios start with the reference case. And then we change 1 or 2 things that we're testing, the what ifs, that then to see what happens. Again, all the scenarios meet the 3 anchor energy policy objectives. For example, a scenario may look at a lower than expected electrification or lower than expected EV adoption, or further constrained transmission, or constrained siting resulting in lower adoption of renewables. Click, Jillian. When we then compare the results of the scenarios back to the reference case. So we compare the delta of the financial and co-benefit results. So the model doesn't give us any answers, but it does illuminate the difference between the reference case and the scenarios that we've developed. So by doing this, we gain a deeper understanding of the trade-offs between the reference case and the scenarios. And the value of this comes into play during the phase of our process where we develop energy strategy recommendations. Click, Jillian. So what do the deltas tell us? How do they inform the development of our recommendations after the modeling? For example, if scenario 2 shows lower benefits and lower co-benefits than the reference case, we might want to come up with recommendations that help us avoid the outcomes of scenario 2, or make sure we create the recommendations that help ensure the outcomes of the reference case. So hopefully this explanation shows why this modeling is different than what we usually do in IRP or least cost planning processes. And I hope this explanation, along with Edith's explanation of the last slide of what the model does and doesn't do, are helpful. I'll pass it back to Edith.
Thanks, Alan. And if we can go to the next slide, I'm just going to elaborate for a moment on what Alan was saying. So we're in an earlier stage of defining the alternative scenarios, but we are converging around these three, certainly, scenarios, which are really important both to test some of the biggest risks that we face in whether we do or don't implement the level of measures and that are built into the assumptions in the reference scenario, and also to reflect the feedback that we've heard and to test out kind of what happens if we were to look at assumptions that are quite different from how the reference is framed. And so two of these are really counterpoints to the aggressive but achievable framing for electrification levels for transportation and buildings end uses and aggressive energy efficiency. So we have here, what if electrification and energy efficiency in buildings is lower? So what if we rely more on alternative fuels and other technologies? And what if electrification in transportation is lower? And then it's really clear to us, and has been from the start, and this has been reinforced by the discussions that we've had in the working groups and in various other engagements, that transmission is one of the biggest risks and also one of the most influential areas in determining how we meet our energy policy objectives. And so we're looking at a scenario that would constrain transmission. And as you can see, scenarios 3 and 4 we just left open for now. We'll go into more detail into what we're seeing and what topics kind of are coming together for potential scenarios, including what 3 and 4 might look like. But I just wanted to kind of complement what Alan said with a more concrete example of how this is probably going to look, or how it's shaping up at the moment, to also inform our conversation today. So if we go to the next slide. And this is my last slide before we pause for any clarifying questions. So I think it's important to just provide a bit of perspectives on the differences between the two models and kind of how they work together in the analysis that will be undertaken. So on the demand side, there's a model that looks at Oregon's economy across about 80 end-use sectors and all fuels. It looks at energy consuming technologies and at stock rollover over time. So, how long is the average lifetime of an air conditioner or your average car? And the model calculates energy needs for all of these technologies and makes but it also makes key assumptions such as energy efficiency and electrification rates for appliances and transportation. And these are inputs into the model. Some of these key assumptions are inputs and serve to help us understand what happens if we electrify at a certain rate, if we if we meet a certain level of energy efficiency. And these inputs were the focus of much of the engagement in the working groups, and that's why you'll see the focus for a lot of the demand side discussions, even today, is on these inputs. Then the supply side model takes all of that, kind of what comes out of the demand side model. We say, this is how much energy we need. And it looks across the economy at how we meet that demand with the constraint that we have to meet our climate targets and our that have been set in law. And it looks at the full mix of supply side resources and transmission build out, and those are really outputs of the model. So the model informs us about, what the lowest cost mix of resources is to meet that demand. And so the main focus on the supply side model has really been on describing the approach, how the model works, and then focusing on certain assumptions that help reflect kind of how key parts of the sector are evolving and where some of the unknowns are. So some of the discussions have been around distribution costs and transmission build out, for example. So with that kind of rounds out the background. This is a complicated exercise, and we thought it was worth just taking a few minutes to talk through some of these important points. And I'd now like to just pause here and see if there are any clarifying questions at this point on any of this kind of broad structural information about the model. And Ben, I'll hand it to you to facilitate if there are any hands raised.
Yeah, thanks, Edith. So this is one of those points, as promised earlier, where having a strong grounding in what the model is before we move into the reference scenario. We're going to pause here. So just any questions for clarity, or how this relates to kind of the work that we'll be doing in the future? Corey.
Edith, you may have made this more clear and I just missed it, but I think I heard early on that this model is not kind of a least cost planning model to be compared to other least cost planning models that are out there. And then I heard the output of the model is kind of a least cost scenario to meet the load needs. Can you just help me kind of better understand that dynamic where those two things sound like you're saying something different around the same words, but I suspect there's just another level of detail that helps understand the distinction there.
Yeah, thank you. So I will explain this in my words, and I'll ask whether Alan or somebody else wants to add to this. But when I say that it's not a least cost planning model, I am distinguishing the role of this model, which looks across the full economy and gives us a view of kind of potential ways to meet our policy objectives, which is different from kind of projecting out the least cost least cost investment plan, which is more of the kind of utility planning perspective. It is a capacity expansion model that does consider cost. So, and I probably was getting tangled up in the words that I was using, so I apologize for that. But it does, it does have the discipline of trying to go out and get the least cost resources and solving for what mix of resources you need to meet demand. I don't know, Alan, if you would want to add anything to that, if you think I'm still
Yeah,
about it.
I think a clarification that helps for the utility folks is that it is a least cost model. So it does build up the least cost portfolio, given the constraints that we put in and the goals that we're trying to achieve. But it's not an IRP process. So the IRP process that a lot of you are used to builds up a scenario, kind of predicts the future, and then that gets used for cost recovery in the IRP process that the PUC regulates. So we're not trying to build up necessarily the answer for it as you do in an IRP process. What we're trying to do, as Edith and I were trying to explain, was the least cost planning model creates the reference scenario, which kind of builds out the likely future with the aggressive but achievable parameters. And then we're trying to test constraints or what if scenarios and see what happens to the reference case. And by doing that, we then get informed about what happens if we go down that scenario pathway. And that will help us then inform the recommendations that we make about where we want to go and what we need to do and what new things we need to do and figure out what kind of research projects we need to do in the end towards getting to the three anchor objectives. So it's kind of a twist on the least cost planning IRP process, but it does indeed use a least cost model.
Okay, thank you. So let's go Michael, Scott, Joshua.
Thanks. Yeah. So I know we at Energy Trust were talking through this the other day about trying to clarify what are the outputs? Has that been shared anywhere specifically? I think we were trying to figure out, and I think you started Edith talking about it in this presentation maybe for us, but understanding, so we're looking at these assumptions that are going in as inputs, and then you're going to look at the reference model compared to the various what if scenarios, and you're talking about looking at this delta, but a delta between what? What are the outputs that the model is looking at? And I don't know that we could find that in any of the materials that have been shared with the working group or anything. Is it really, I mean, maybe that answer to Corey's question just now helps to clarify it. Is the delta the sort of supply mix difference? Like in this what if scenario, we're going to rely more on X versus Y. But aren't some of your levers also some of the assumptions that are inputs going into the models? I would think like efficiency and renewable distributed energy resources, for instance, would be levers that would be deltas in the different what if scenarios, but they're also seem like inputs and you're making assumptions about those in the model. So I'm sorry if that's kind of all over the place, but we were trying to really try to suss out like, what is it the model's telling us and what are we comparing in each of these scenarios?
Well, and Edith and Alan, so thank you, Michael, because I wonder if some of the questions might be answered in the next section as you go through where some of those kind of what are the inputs into the model. But Edith or Alan, do you want to, I could be wrong.
Yeah, I think it is worth pausing. So this is a very good question, and it does get to the heart of like what are we going to learn? What's going to come out of this whole thing? So I appreciate the question. So first of all, you're right, Michael, that one of the key outputs will be what that resource mix looks like on the supply side. And so we'll get a sense of, for example, when we have a constrained transmission scenario, we anticipate that will mean that we need to build more distributed resources, for example. And because suddenly those will be more cost competitive with what's available, since lower cost resources from outside of Oregon might not be available to the level that the reference scenario might deliver. But there is a key distinction, which you've also put your finger on, which is that, and to be perfectly honest, it took me a while to get here myself in my head. We are not energy efficiency and demand response are not resources that are competing for cost effectiveness with the supply side to deliver those outputs. And the reason is that there are a lot of very complex, as you know, assumptions that need to be made around price elasticity of demand and behavior. We often don't yet have the programs necessarily to deliver the levels of energy efficiency that others and electrification that some of the regional studies that we reviewed say we need. And so what we're doing is selecting, kind of based on a literature review and based on what we've heard in the working groups, an aggressive but achievable level, and just saying, this is to the best, this is kind of an informed assumption on aggressive but achievable levels of energy efficiency and electrification in the reference scenario. And so we just set it. And I think that's been an area of discomfort, because it is going beyond, there's some imagination and some serious analysis required here. But then by having an alternative scenario where we get less of it, and this will be another conversation, is kind of where we set that lower level of efficiency and electrification to test out the difference in terms of system costs. The benefit here is that we learn what the difference is in system costs between the two. We're not projecting that it's going to be, as I think Jessica typed in the chat, we're not projecting that it's going to be the level in the reference or the level in the alternative, but we do want those to be reasonable, you know, possible futures. So I hope that that's helpful and answers your question.
Yeah, I'll add
Thank
to
you.
that. So again, all of the scenarios start with the reference case, and we want to clarify why we're doing it the way that we're doing and comparing the reference case to the scenario. So this modeling doesn't occur in a vacuum or in isolation. There have been many other studies that have been done in this area, and they all show the same thing, that the aggressive but achievable electrification scenario is the least cost path. So it doesn't make sense to start with a non-least cost path and therefore embed that in each of the scenarios, because each scenario starts with the reference case, and then test actions on that scenario that make the financial picture even worse. So it's better to start with the least cost path and see what happens if we diverge from it. So that will give us a more valuable insight into the results of the constraints that we're testing, those what-if scenarios. And this allows us to then come up with recommendations that reinforce the path of the reference case or avoid the constraints that are in some of the scenarios, which will probably be non-least cost paths. So we're using it to create lessons learned from looking at those scenarios. So it does. They all of the scenarios that have to meet the 3 anchor criteria, so they're meeting our goals and objectives, and it does, as you said, Michael, change the supply mix. The energy efficiency part is kind of fixed in it because the model doesn't deal with that, and so then it changes the supply mix, and what you get as the outputs are the costs and the co-benefits. And so, and by looking at that delta between the scenario, that what if constraint, and the reference scenario, we look at that and see what happens if we change something. What if we have constrained transmission more than we already have? What if we don't get the renewables? What if we don't get on the path to electrification with heat pumps and EVs? Remember, this is economy-wide, all fuels, so EV is an important part of the mix as well. So what happens to all those? What happens to the costs and benefits, the energy wallet that the EJ group is really focused in on? What happens to all of those things, and how does it compare back to the reference case, and what do we learn from that to help us create the recommendations coming out of this process?
Yeah, thank you both. So I'm going to do a little bit of a process check. We got 5 questions. I know this is a really important kind of foundational underpinning for the conversation we are going to have. So, you know, I think we should probably spend a few more minutes here. If folks have questions that could be put in the chat and answered, I'll ask you to do that. But let's go, Scott, Joshua, Shannon.
All right, well, good morning again, Scott Sims, PVC. I just was curious if there's a way to see, and apologize for my camera not being on, I'll have to fix that. But I just wanted to see if there is a way to share with us some of the changes that were made in the reference case based on public input. And if not, if there's somewhere where we might be seeing where those comments have been received, and kind of just the flavor of kind of the inputs that came into the reference case work.
Yeah, so Scott, we're going there next, right?
Oh, okay. Apologies.
So we didn't, you weren't queued up on purpose, but yes, that will be the next conversation. So if you have comments, please save them. Joshua.
There we go.
Yeah, thanks. I have a question about one of the limitation or constraints that was on one of the model scenarios. Could you go up a couple slides to that slide? The one that has the reference case with the, yeah, thank you. So my question is, this constraint where you say, what if electrification and transportation is lower? I'm just wondering, how does this kind of translate with discrete policy goals that we already have in place? So we have a new EV vehicle goal by 2035. Does this constraint, is it in conflict with that goal? I'm just wondering if we have constraints in some of the model scenarios that are conflicting with current policy goals that we're inputting that in order to determine what policy should be. So it seems like a weirdly like perverse thing. So just wondering about that.
I would ask Jillian if you want to take this one and just give an answer to understanding that we haven't fully fleshed this scenario out yet, obviously.
Sure, happy to. And thanks for the question, Joshua. I'll just say where there is existing policy, so you mentioned advanced clean cars too, those assumptions are built into the model. So it is not in conflict with that existing policy. We are following the percentage sales targets established by those policies. And that's true, not just in transportation, but across the board. Where there's existing policy, we do use that to guide our assumptions.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yep, thanks, Joshua. And we will have a section on our agenda about what if questions, so feel free to bring that back up. Shannon, Susan.
Hi, thanks. I was wondering, how will you be capturing the additional costs like transmission if they're necessary to import the lowest cost resource in the reference scenario, for example? Like how will this, at what point will the total system cost be evaluated for that comparison between the reference and the other scenarios?
I'm not sure I understand. Shannon, are you asking how granular the information will be, or is it a general question on how transmission costs are factored into the costs of different resources being delivered to meet our goals in Oregon? Maybe it's the latter.
Option 2, exactly. How will the transmission cost be incorporated, and at what point?
I might suggest Michael Friels, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that we can answer that question when we get to the transmission slide that we're showing a little bit later on.
Great, thanks.
We can dig into that.
Okay.
But at the end, one of the outputs of each of the runs that we do, the reference case or any of the scenarios, is the total system cost. And and it's that total system cost that we'll be comparing. That's the delta. And embedded in that are the assumptions for aggressive but achievable that are in the reference case. And then what if we change something? So if we constrain transmission further than it's already constrained, what happens, and what supply mix change do we get? What cost change do we get? What co-benefits do we get? Again, all of them still have to meet the anchor 3 policy objectives.
All right, thanks, Ed. Let's go to Jimmy. Jimmy, your hand went down. Are you talking? Let's see.
Oh, great. Thank you for interrupting me and helping me with my mute button. Yes, this may have been covered earlier, and just appreciate the opportunity to kind of clarify this. I'm curious about the way that this exercise is characterizing cost. A moment ago, we were kind of contrasting against some of the traditional like IRP planning exercises, which typically look at costs from the perspective of like ratepayers, and they think about how much are these activities expected to cost customers, and that's like a methodology that's been in contrast to what's like oftentimes done in like an energy efficiency setting, where we're looking at cost benefit analyses and total system costs. And I wondered if you could clarify for me how this modeling exercise is thinking about the categories of costs and categories of benefits. And happy to clarify that question some more if it's unclear.
I can start, and Alan might want to add to this. I appreciate the question. It's an important one, because and we have heard quite a few comments about whether we're considering co-benefits, which I think is part of your question here. So I mean, the model will give a sense of the cost in terms of the cost of different resources to meet demand. we will be conducting some additional analyses to try to get at some of the co-benefits and kind of an understanding of the cost impacts as they affect customers, kind of understanding the kind of what it means for households, because there's a difference, which you're alluding to, between the system costs looked at a certain way and the co-benefits, but also the costs as they kind of relate to households and other consumers. So Alan mentioned that we have been working with the Environmental Justice and Equity Group, and we'll continue to work with them on defining a household energy wallet, which essentially looks today at 5 representative households. So we need to define what those will be, but you can imagine a low-income urban household compared to a low-income rural household, for example, who have very different driving patterns and might have different kind of typical technologies that they're using for heating and cooling. And that energy wallet looks across all fuels. So it's not just power, it's also how much you're spending to power your car and how much you're spending on heat if you heat with gas, for example. So it combines all of that. And that will provide some insights between the scenarios into what the costs mean for a household. So we won't just see the system costs, but we'll see kind of the change in how much folks are paying and for what, and how that sugars out in terms of how much folks are paying for energy overall. We're also going to do this analysis using the EPA COBRA model. So it's an additional modeling exercise that we'll be doing to understand the air quality impacts of different scenarios and what that means for public health. So that's kind of on starting to look at some of the co-benefits of and where they come out in different scenarios. And we'll also be looking at jobs. So we'll be doing a separate jobs analysis to understand the employment impacts of different scenarios. So we will be digging into some of the dimensions of different co-benefits and just different implications of kind of different potential of different scenarios on Oregonians. There's a limit on how much we can do with the budget that we have. And I think that the recommendations might speak to how we can dig in more into certain areas, but I'll see if Alan wants to add anything to what I've just said.
No, that was a good enumeration of the co-benefits that we'll be looking at. Again, looking at the delta between the reference case and the scenario to see what that tells us.
Yep.
Not just
Thanks so
cost, but
much.
co-benefits.
So I think I interpreted that to mean this methodology is at its core like similar to an IRP process, looking at like utility costs, ratepayer costs, with some additional work that's sort of focusing on kind of affordability and co-benefits in a detailed way. Is that a sort of fair characterization? Okay, thanks so much.
Yeah. Well, let's keep moving. So we're gonna dive deeper into and reflective of some of the questions that we pushed out. But let's move into the next session. So we're gonna answer a question that was posed earlier, and then we're gonna kind of walk, as Jessica put in the chat, through specific topics. So Gilly, if you want to move the slide, and then Edith, you want to kick us off on the how we're
So I really appreciate those questions that just came up, and we're going to dig into some of these more now. So the next 2 slides, if we just go to the next slide, I will try to cover relatively quickly to get to more of the discussion. But what we wanted to do here was we're trying to balance here the amount of time that we have and really wanting to have a productive discussion with you. So the next 2 slides will highlight some of the areas where we are considering or have proposed making a change and what that's based on. And Scott, I think that'll get a bit of your question about, I think it was Scott, of how we're incorporating what we've heard and what we're doing with it. It won't cover everything because we don't have time to go through everything line by line. But then what we'll do is we'll dig in even further and present some specific questions for you all. So we're kind of putting it back to you where we have heard a lot of feedback and where we're still really thinking about this, about some key assumptions. So just to run through these couple of slides. So on transportation, we received feedback on VMT's vehicle miles traveled, so on VMT reduction targets, that we have kind of an existing policy of reducing VMT per capita by 2050 from the climate friendly and equitable communities goal, and that we should be treating that like all other policies, that we build them into the reference scenario. And so we originally, our starting point was assuming flat VMT per capita through 2050. What we're proposing is to incorporate that VMT goal into the reference scenario. But what we're also doing, and we've talked to our consultants about this, is to include in the alternative scenarios a sensitivity where, and Jillian, you can jump in if I'm misrepresenting or misspeaking here in any way, but we'll be looking in a couple of the alternative scenarios at what happens if that were flat, so that we can get a sense of what that VMT goal is achieving when we look at the overall system costs. We received quite a few comments and have been receiving, and I would say we received some in writing last Wednesday night, but we've been receiving comments all along about commercial hot water heat pumps. And we've been kind of digging in and doing some research as those comments have been coming in. One kind of focused change that we're recommending is we've gotten feedback, and we understand that there are very real barriers to commercial hot water heat pumps being used in large commercial spaces. And so we're moving that 25% of all new sales being electric heat pumps by 2030. We're moving it out to 2035 to allow an extra 5 years for that kind of industry transformation to happen. And we will talk more about the other numbers here in a moment. So I'm just trying to flag a specific change that we're suggesting. On demand response participation, the question that we've posed to the working groups, and particularly to the efficiency and load flexibility group, is what percentage of eligible stock is participating? And really the way that this is framed, sort of the input in the model, is what percentage of households and commercial end users participate in some form of firm DR commitment. So this goes beyond something like critical peak pricing, and it's really some sort of direct load control by the utility or something that is very close to that. And we had trouble getting any numbers from the engagement. So we heard some comments. You can see them here. Somebody mentioned that the Midwest ISO, MISO, is achieving right now 10% demand response savings at peak. We've reviewed the demand response potentials that PGE and PacifiCorp have identified, and we've also been reviewing several other studies to understand both what is happening today and what the potentials are. And given the kind of one finding that we have found really interesting is that as electrification increases, your opportunities for demand response participation increase. And Oregon has a requirement that heat pump hot water heaters be equipped to be demand response ready, for example. And that's kind of a game changer. And you can see this in some of BPA's analysis on the on what you might expect in terms of demand response. So that's where that 50% number comes from. And then this is actually a clarification and not a change, but we double checked with our consultants to be sure that we're understanding how the model is working. And I just wanted to point out that the dual fuel gas electric heat pump systems compete with other electric technologies in line with the sales shares set for residential and commercial electrification assumptions that would be inputs into the model. I thought that was an important clarification to make. If we go to the next slide. We also received a number of comments on transmission development. So we have the assumption that there's no new transmission until 2035, and then started to dig in the working group into, well, which lines that are in advanced stages of planning and development would be assumed to come online before or by 2035. And one comment was that for Boardman to Hemingway, 2025 was too soon. So we've changed that date to 2030. We have 5-year increments that we're modeling. And so where we get a date like 2032 or 2033, we have to sort of round in one direction or the other. And I think we tend to round to the next date since we can't assume it'll be there before it is. So that's just a limitation of the model. And you can see here, and we'll talk about it shortly, Michael will lead a discussion about some of the other projects that we're considering, and we're continuing to do this analysis. And if anybody has data that they want to share, this is something that Jeremy will be working through our modeler as he populates the model with this data. We also will speak shortly about data center load growth. There's a lot of concern just about the significant uncertainty. Are we over planning? Are we under planning? This is not a plan, but in general, you know, in incorporating an assumption for the strategy, are we being are we setting the right level? And so that's going to be a discussion that we want to have with you in a little bit. But our starting point has been to use the Northwest Power Conservation Council's base case in their resource adequacy assessment for 2029. And then we've also received quite a few questions about hydrogen that kind of dug into concern about how hydrogen is or is not competing with other resources in the model. And so again, Michael will lead a discussion on this in a little bit, but we confirmed that renewable hydrogen can be used in the model to replace direct use fuels, and you can see that there are some inputs here for it. So with that, I'd ask to go to the next slide, and I'd like to pause again for a conversation and really to understand whether there are any questions or comments about the proposed changes that you've been reading through. It doesn't have to relate to the ones that we've shown on the slides. As I said, we'll start digging into those a bit more, but I recognize that we gave you some really broad homework to listen to the last working group meeting, read through that presentation, and then have a look at the draft reference scenario, kind of the long list that we put up online on August 28th. So this is just a moment to pause and see if there are more specific questions or comments that folks would like to share before we dive into some of the areas that I just signaled up above.
Good, thanks, Edith. Shannon, I think that's your old hand still up. Ivy, let's come to you.
All right, hey guys, so my question is on the slide that you had previously, the timing of the transmission development, how come no new transmission until 2035? What's the reason until waiting for that length of time to start on it?
What?
Michael, do you want to take this one, or do you want me to?
I'm happy to jump in. Okay, so Ivy, yeah, thank you for your question. And so the reason we're assuming no transmission until 2035 is basically because we recognize that the length of time it takes to go through the permitting, siting process to develop projects. And so in looking at the list of transmission projects kind of at the planning or development phases far along that we know about, it's hard to imagine there'll be new transmission, or I guess what we've heard from people is that it's hard to imagine there'll be more projects that will come in sooner than that. And it's also a function of the model that the model looks at it in 5-year increments. And so if it's not 2035, it would be like 2030, and we think that's too soon. So we kind of set 2035, but we're still open to comments on this. And if there are other projects that are, I want to say at the planning phase or real that we should list, we're certainly excited to include that within the model. We just don't think there's going to be a lot of, or I guess we haven't heard that there's going to be a lot of projects that are not fully baked at this point that would be able to be realized by 2035. But we're open to comments on that. Does that answer your question, Ivy?
Well,
Yes,
Mike, oh, sorry, Ivy.
Go ahead, Ben, go.
Well, I guess the updated model input, Michael, do you want to speak to how the model then is going to incorporate some of the projects that are referenced here? So Ivy, your question around 2035 in the middle of this slide, right? The original was no new, and the updated is no new except for a few advanced. And Michael, I think you are reflecting that, right? So some of the feedback around projects that are in the pipeline that could be included within that timeline are. Is there more to say about that, or is that? I just want to make sure, Ivy, you're seeing the kind of way this slide is structured, that the updated input actually includes some of those that are in the pipeline. No pun intended.
No, I appreciate you guys. The reason, I mean, I could speak because we manufactured the transmission towers, right? We are currently working on the Boardman to Hemingway already. We've actually done quite a bit for that in the last 1.5 years. The problem that I'm seeing that when we say no new transmission till 2035 because we're expecting that getting these zoning permits, getting approved through the landowners to the tribes, to all the stakeholders getting approved that we may not be able to catch up on the timing for that. And that's my biggest concern there by 2035. The sooner that we can expedite on all the stakeholders to get that approved sooner, the better, because it depends on different towers that we're making, whether they're getting expanded, whether they need to be replaced. There's a lot of pieces and components that comes into that. And for our small businesses that's doing that already, it could take up a whole year for just about 4 towers. At most we can do 10 towers per year, but you don't have a lot of manufacturers where you say, yep, I got the money, let's go ahead and do it. Everyone's on the same board. It's going to take a lot of time to get that built. It's not something that's easy cut and dry done. And we definitely want to keep things domestic with our raw materials here in the US too. So just some heads up for you.
Yeah, that's exactly right. There is a time frame, a long time frame to get these projects in the ground or on the ground. Irene, correct me if I'm wrong, but the model doesn't start saying, okay, now you can do a new project in 2035. The model allows for new transmission to come online in 2035. So it takes into consideration that we'll be working on it along the way. So the model then will say, okay, we need new transmission in 2035 and start building it into the model and the costs. So it does take into consideration that we'll be working on it in the interim. It just takes a long time, as you well know.
It's a really big thing because when it comes passing down from, let's say, BPA down to a general contractor that's holding this, they have to find manufacturers to build this too. And there's not a lot of companies that you can just go around domestically and say, here it is, we need to build this out. Can you do 10, or 140 of them within 2 years? It's not possible. So the sooner the better. So that way we have the time to span out, build it. They go through quality assurance. They're finalized on each component pieces of the milestones with that.
Yeah, and one more clarifying point, that the model works in 5-year increments. So the inputs occur at the 5-year period. So 2030, 2035, 2040.
Yeah, that's helpful.
I'll just jump in very briefly, Ben. I appreciate you moving us along. I just wanted to say that I think, Ivy, your points will be really important when we get into the policy discussions. So I encourage you to bring it back up then, because I think that this is, the modeling can only do so much for us. It'll help inform kind of what things look like under different scenarios, but the proof is in the pudding. It must be lunchtime. Yeah.
This is helpful though. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks. Laura?
The clarification on the heat pump issue brought me back to a how does the model work question, because you mentioned competition between technologies and the sales shares. And I guess I had been thinking that the sales shares were an input and then the supply side was where the model was making choices, but it sounds like there's maybe some competition on the sales shares input side as well. So hoping you could just clarify that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I will explain this at a very high level because I think that Jeremy would be needed to explain exactly how the model does this. But as I understand it, we set an electrification goal, but there are still a lot of technologies within that are competing. There are different companies making different heat pumps. And so what I was saying was that and I would ask our consultants to stop me if I'm misspeaking, but as I understand it, there's still competition between these different technologies. And so the clarification is that dual fuel heat pumps would be one of those technologies that is in there. And then there is, there are some price assumptions. And so it's not a completely static input. It's an input within which there are still some assumptions being made on price and technology development, things like that.
Okay. So some of these themes we'll revisit as we go through and continue the conversation. So I'm going to move us on. Lauren, I think we want to move in. So we're going to move into more topic-based discussions. So if we go next slide.
Good morning, everyone. I apologize for my voice today. I'm Lauren Rosenstein, the Community Equity and Inclusion Analyst. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Environmental Justice and Equity Working Group today. This working group intersects across all of the working groups. We've made the effort to both have representatives from organizations who are rooted in environmental justice and equity in each of the advisory groups, as well as bring topics that were discussed in other working groups to this working group. In digging into the conversations, we found many of the comments and questions, concerns, ideas, and solutions are going to be important in the complementary analysis, which is a little bit of what we just talked about. And that will build on the modeling to include a definition of representative household or energy wallets to investigate impacts of different scenarios on costs, applying a GIS mapping tool to analyze potential geospatial impacts and opportunities of modeling results, and analyzing air quality effects of different pathways on public health. Because of the work to unpack this by the working group, it was decided that we needed additional meeting times, and we're working to schedule one later this month or early next month to have a more robust discussion. We're also working to best address the need to have ongoing conversations throughout this process that provide an environmental justice and equity lens across topics, and are looking forward to ensuring meaningful engagement, which has really been expressed by the working group members. Because so much of the discussion was rooted in policy and the complementary analysis, this is a slightly different report out than what you're about to hear from the other groups. And while we're not speaking to policy or the other analyses today, I do think it's important to keep it in mind as you listen and comment throughout this process, and especially today. I really encourage everyone to check out the working group recordings that are on the website for the Environmental Justice and Equity Working Group. There was a lot of great conversation that you'll find relevant as you keep moving through this process. That's it from me, and I'm going to pass it back to my colleague, Edith.
Good. So I think we'll just pause really quick if there's any clarifying questions. Obviously, this is something that'll be an ongoing conversation. As Lauren said, it's cross-cutting. Folks have talked about co-benefits, some of the equity and environmental justice impacts, but any questions for clarity on the EJ and Equity Working Group? Okay, let's keep moving. And again, as questions come up, feel free to throw them in the chat. I am going to kind of move us quick. We got a lot of things to move through, and so as we go through these next sections, we might have to truncate some of the conversations. But Edith, we going to you?
Thanks, Ben. So I feel like I can probably be quite brief on this slide since I gave a bit of an introduction earlier. So I think demand response is one of those areas where it's something that we see as growing in importance, and there'll be a lot of technological development enabling more demand response at the same time that it becomes more important for integration of variable renewable resources on the system. And so the question that I'm teeing up here is whether there are any additional perspectives to help inform the level of DR demand response participation that we anticipate out to 2050, understanding again that this is not a projection of how much we will get, but we do want it to represent a reasonable assumption that's aggressive but achievable out to 2050.
Good, thanks, Edith. So you see the question on the bottom of the slide around additional perspectives or thoughts about the demand response participation rate. So I'll just pause. Good. And at any point, we can come back to these. So we'll, you can see this as at least an introduction. If there are other thoughts that you have around the demand response participation rate, we can come back to it. Let's.
And this is Jimmy, VGP.
Yes.
Lots of different types of ways customers participate in DR, some of which, might be easier than others. Is your question kind of broad, any level of participation, participating in like time of use, tariffs, for example, or is it meant to be something more narrow with respect to like a programmatic technology enabled thing.
Yeah, good question, Edith.
Yeah, it is a good question. And this is part of the struggle in looking at what's out there and what this is. So this would, we've had this discussion with our modeler for us to also understand. So the way that he's described it is that this would really be firm demand response. And so it would go beyond pricing, and it would be more along the lines of direct load control, or another, if there's another mechanism where there's a high degree of certainty that demand response, kind of this 50% would be responding. I've seen kind of 95% as a participation rate, I think, in the BPA Cadmus study. So that's what I was. Maybe that's a helpful steer on how we're thinking about this. Is that helpful?
Definitely. Yeah, that's useful to appreciate. And then, to answer that question, which I'd be happy to sort of assist with or provide perspective on, it would be helpful to appreciate like how, demanding is this program? I mean, how many hours and how frequently would the disruption be for a customer to help understand how likely it is that you get to these achievement rates in the future?
So I think we can paste that into the chat. I can do it when others are presenting, Jimmy, because we do have a slide on the parameters that you're talking about.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
And then any other thoughts? Yeah, let's keep moving. Again,
Ben?
Jessica, yeah.
I'll just flag that Jeff Hammerland in the comments added something that kind of goes along with this, which is it seems like understanding the assumptions around long-term, mid-term, and short-term energy storage would be equally important in this area. So I just wanted to capture that.
Great, thank you for flagging that piece. And
it looks like there's a question too from Scott Sims that just popped up. Can I throw that one in there?
Please. So it's around cross-tabbing
Yes,
with
you got it.
states that are more mature. Do you see the question, Edith? So is that part of what they're doing, is kind of doing that?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
so, I mean, for example, I think that the California demand response studies that have happened recently that Lawrence Berkeley Labs have conducted for the CPUC are really interesting and instructive, both in what's happening now, but also this kind of interplay between technology uptake and demand response capability. If there are any, I would just say if there are any reports that you think we should look at, we're very happy to look at them, because again, this is an area where we really have to look at what's happening elsewhere. And then I'll just add that we're not assuming any particular policy here. What we're trying to do is build in kind of a reasonable level we might expect to be able to get of that demand response participation, see what that means in terms of overall kind of system costs and benefits, and then have the policy discussion. So hopefully this would help inform that policy discussion.
Great, thank you. Well, let's keep moving to buildings. Edith, is that you?
Oh yeah, it is. I thought I was off the hook, but yeah,
Nope,
still have buildings to cover here. So I've mentioned hot water heating. So I'm framing it up a little bit differently here. Up top, I wanted to frame up that extra time that we are suggesting going from 2030 to 2035 to ramp up new sales for electric heat pumps for large commercial facilities. But more broadly, we're seeing that comments are kind of pushing in one of two directions. One of them is, really saying that there's a lot of potential here for electric heat pump sales for hot water heating to rise even beyond the kind of 95% level that we have here. And then we've also heard support for a lower level, which is reflected in what was really our starting point for discussions with the working groups, which is based on an MOU that our Department of Environmental Quality signed with several other states that has this goal of 65% share of overall sales being electric heat pumps by 2030 and 90% by 2040. So, we're still evaluating the many comments that have come in on this. And for example, there was a comment to look at the advanced water heating initiative and the goals that are set there. And so that's something that we're looking into. We also you know, are cognizant of the Oregon Climate Action Commission's analysis that set a 100% target. And I'm forgetting the year, but it may have been sales by 2040 or 2045. So we're still working on this, and so I'm really happy to hear your feedback. So that's hot water heating. On cooking and other appliances, there have been a lot of really good comments about 100% and why there are some barriers to getting all the way to 100% of electric sales for cooking and for new cooking and other appliances. And so we're considering, as you can see here, lowering this to 90% to reflect some of the barriers brought up in comments. One that we heard more than once was commercial cooking, for example. Not all commercial, you know, not all restaurants might go electric, and so that's a big question mark, and there are some barriers there. So I'll pause and see if anybody wants to provide any additional perspectives or information that we should be looking at in considering these assumptions.
Good, thanks, Edith. And I think maybe a particular emphasis on the consideration bullet around the 90% of sales. Any thoughts there? Open it up more broadly. Brian?
Yeah, one of the concerns I have with even the 95% overall sales by 2045 is the efficiency and real world use of electric heat pumps in some of the eastern part of the state, colder climates. We've received a lot of feedback. I've personally converted an electric heat pump, and it's not efficient or really works during the colder weather as we get down into the teens or below. And so I'd be concerned about a 95% sales rate by 2045, given some of the considerations in the colder parts of the state.
Good, thanks, Brian.
Thanks,
thoughts?
Brian.
Oh, sorry.
I just want to point out again that we are including hybrid heat pumps here too, and one of the big reasons for that is the colder climates. And so I hope that addresses some of your concern. If you have, we're still accepting feedback, so we're happy to hear if that does not address the concern. As I said, you know, there'll be competition between technologies, and so that is a technology that seems to have more traction and provide some more assurance for folks in colder climate areas.
No, and I appreciate that feedback. I guess where then I think that there's a little bit of a gap is around the building and codes and the coding of gas type of appliances and whether or not there's going to be an alignment for that hybrid heat pumps versus kind of getting rid of all gas related appliances.
Good, thanks.
I would really encourage that you bring that up when we get into the policy discussions, because I think that's where those kinds of that kind of nitty-gritty conversation will happen. I just want to mention too that the model does include variations in heat pump efficiencies by climate zones. So just so you know, we don't make an overly optimistic kind of operational assumption when we look at colder zones, which might also be useful.
All right, excellent. Thanks for the clarification.
Yeah, thanks, Brian.
Thanks, everyone.
Other questions on buildings or any additional thoughts on the consideration bullet?
Ben, we've got a question in the comments from Tucker.
Yeah, will all the comments on the reference scenario be made publicly available so policymakers have them available?
Tucker, yes. So the short answer is yes. We have a tracking system for every comment that we've received, and we need to respond to every one of them. In some cases, they're bundled together because we receive very similar comments on the same topic area, and so in that case, we'll roll them up. I think part of your question might go to the discussion that happened in our last meeting about how this will be accessible, that it not be just buried in an annex. So we will have that detailed annex, and we think that that's really important to really be accountable to everything that we heard. And we are not yet at the phase of drafting the part of the report where it's still pretty early, the part of the report where we would be reflecting kind of what we heard and what we did with it at a higher level to signal kind of what the differing comments were on the reference scenario, including ones that we didn't incorporate. But we'll make sure that during that process, there's an opportunity for you to feedback and see how we're doing that and input into that to make sure that we're kind of striking that right balance.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Tucker, for that question. So let's keep moving. If we can go to direct use fuels. Michael, I think you're going to go. And again, just, I'm going to keep moving us just because we got a lot to move through, but please continue to add questions, comments in the chat. Michael.
Excellent. Thank you, Ben. So for the direct use fuels conversation, in looking at the direct use fuels modeling for the reference scenario, we focused on electricity, clean fuels growth, and operations needed to meet fuel demand while decarbonizing over time. So for industrial high heat applications, we'll need to transition to low carbon fuels like renewable hydrogen, ammonia, renewable natural gas, or other biofuels. And in the working group, we discussed the availability of these alternative fuels, Oregon's dependence on regional and national fuel production, and the cost to produce and distribute these fuels. So electrification is likely to occur in low heat industrial applications where it's cost effective and feasible. So the reference scenario assumes a high rate of electrification in Oregon, which are reflected in these assumptions. And this list isn't comprehensive, but I've got a few examples of kind of the electrification within that sector. So we're assuming for machine drives, they've electrified by 2035, industrial low heat demand by 2050, refrigeration by 2040, 90% of industrial HVAC loads electrified by 2050, 80% of industrial or agricultural vehicles by 2050. So this was a starting point that was recommended by SETI and our contractor, and that we vetted within our working group. And we've gotten some good public comments kind of about these electrification rates. We've heard both support for these rates of electrification and doubt in their kind of accuracy as we get farther away in our timeline due to concerns about the costs and technology development, which it certainly is to be expected. And we recognize it's hard to really know what would be feasible or cost effective decades from now. And if these are reasonable assumptions. And specifically, we've had a lot of support for these rates of electrification, but some concern or kind of questions around, in particular, the industrial HVAC loads electrifying by 2050, that 90% rate. So that might be something we're still taking comments on and thinking about more, as well as some of the assumptions around integrated steam production, especially around kind of production in food manufacturing. We do assume like an 80% of that is electrified by 2045. And so we've got some interesting comments about that. And so I'm kind of interested, or I guess I'm interested in hearing if this group has any comments about those assumed rates of electrification. Yeah, thank you.
Guys, thanks, Michael.
Tried to go fast, Ben.
Yeah, that was awesome. So, and hopefully folks are picking up on the way we're moving through each of these. So I won't give much direction, but you got some numbers here, looking for a response, reflection, assumed rates. Okay. Well, this will not be the last time. I'm not seeing any hands up. Yeah, I think we just made up our time, folks. So why don't we, I'll pause for another couple seconds. If there's any comments or chat. How about we take a 7-minute break and come back at 10:45? We'll watch somebody change the slide on the break. So instead of 10 minutes, let's get us back on time. We'll take 7 minutes. There it is. Good job. We'll come back at 10:45. See you then. Okay, welcome back. I think I just saw Gilly walk, so we're going to change slides here in a second. I don't think I can do it. So as folks make their way back, give you about 35, 45 more seconds. Give me a chance. You folks will realize I love eating Cheez-Its. It's a little early in the morning, but it gives me one more Cheez-It opportunity. So if we get a thumbs up, camera on, some mechanism to let me know that you're back in the room, that'd be great. And then we're going to move into who's up? Jillian, you're going to move into transportation. Give me 1 second. Okay, so Jillian, you teed up. Gilly, you move us into transportation. There we are. Jillian, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Ben. And good morning, everybody. My name is Jillian DeMedio. I'm a senior policy analyst with Odo and the transportation lead for the Oregon Energy Strategy. So for modeling transportation in the reference scenario, we focused our assumptions around what types of vehicles are driven in Oregon, how much they drive, and how they're fueled. In order to decarbonize this sector, we know that there will be a big shift to electrification, including both battery electric vehicles and hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles. But of course, not every sector will be able to electrify at the same rate, at the same pace, and there will also be, or if at all, and so there will also be a role for low carbon fuels like renewable diesel, renewable natural gas, sustainable aviation fuels, and ammonia. So our working group discussed assumptions around the rate of electrification, as well as the role of hydrogen fuel cell vehicles and low carbon fuels. And there was not much disagreement or comments on most of the reference case assumptions that we propose, particularly where existing policy is really guiding those assumptions. So we talked earlier a little bit about the light duty vehicle side and Oregon's Advanced Clean Cars 2 regulation, which requires that 100% of light duty vehicle sales are zero emission vehicles by 2035. So not many comments on that. And of course, those targets will be worked into our reference scenario. And similarly, on the medium and heavy duty side, we have the Advanced Clean Trucks regulation, which requires an increasing percentage of medium and heavy duty vehicles be zero emission vehicles as well. But this policy only goes out to 2035 and does not get us to 100% electrification in these sectors. And we do know that we will have to get there to 100% for medium heavy duty vehicles, or at least very close to that, to meet our economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals. And that's really because we need to account for other areas of the economy, including some areas of transportation that are much harder to electrify and much harder to decarbonize. So much of our discussion in this working group and with data holders as well has been around what year to assume these vehicles reach 100% of new sales are zero emission vehicles. And where we've landed is for school and transit buses, we are going to be assuming 100% of new sales are zero emission vehicles by 2036. And for all other medium and heavy duty vehicles, 100% of new sales are zero emission vehicles by 2040. And these numbers are really based on a number of different things. So first, it aligns with our aggressive but achievable electrification framing for our reference scenario, which has been mentioned a few times already, so I won't get into that. In addition, we looked at existing policies in other leading states to really ground truth what is achievable in Oregon. And we also looked at a recent study by RMI that found that a significant percentage of existing medium and heavy duty vehicles in Oregon could be electrified today. And then lastly, of course, we consulted with working group members and data holders. And I'll just share that in our first transportation working group meeting, we did start with a more aggressive target. So we actually proposed all of this sector was zero emission vehicle sales by 2036. And while we did hear some support for that target, we also focused a lot of the discussion around the many barriers that still exist for electrification of this sector. So we did push the year back to really reflect that discussion and that feedback. So this updated target does reflect sort of a recognition of those barriers. And then the last thing I do want to just highlight here, again, as Edith mentioned earlier, this aggressive but achievable electrification will be paired with an alternative scenario that does explore a slower electrification rate to really, again, address these concerns around achievability in the rate that we are proposing. So with that, I will pause to see if there are any questions or comments on this approach to vehicle electrification.
Yeah, thanks, Jillian, for laying it out as you did. So questions, comments on how Jillian just described the approach to getting to what you see here? Yep, and Jessica continuing to monitor the chat. So Aaron had a question around for Jillian around sharing the RMI study that you mentioned. So there might
Yes,
just be a note for sharing post meeting, or if there's a link that we can put in
I
the
will
chat.
drop the link in the chat right now.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, not seeing any hands. So thanks for laying that out, Jillian. Again, this won't, if something comes up as we go through the conversation, feel free to add to the chat. Okay. Transmission. Michael?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Ben. So we already kind of touched on transmission a little bit earlier. So for the modeling of transmission and distribution in the reference node, we focus on electricity transmission development, pipeline infrastructure, and electricity distribution costs. So for electricity transmission development assumptions, what we talked about is like the new lines, such as, we already mentioned Boardman the Hemingway and Pacific Power's Gateway project, and also reconductoring or rebuilding existing lines. All of that would be included. And we're working on the assumption that those will all be realized. But beyond that, as we mentioned previously, there won't be any new transmission until 2035. But as we heard from Ivy, there might be concerns about, even meeting that deadline. So that's certainly something to keep in mind. But we have heard concerns that developing new transmission lines within the reference scenario will be a real challenge. And then after, I guess I do want to point out that after 2035, the model will build transmission generally based on need following that time. And so it won't necessarily have direct projects from one site to another so much as generally model that there'll be a need for greater transmission. And so that'd be kind of interesting to see the results of that. And Ivy, you were asking about kind of the transmission constraints. I think you point out some of them as far as like materials and land use, permitting and siting, and the geography of, we're talking about transmission within Oregon, but we're also talking about transmission outside of Oregon, having Oregon access to resources such as wind power in Montana or solar power in the Southwest, and kind of the challenges of getting to that and our kind of limitations on how we can advocate for transmission to our state. And so for existing pipeline infrastructure, we're assuming no new development beyond operations maintenance. And so this is existing fuels. So this does not completely include the infrastructure that may be needed for the incorporation of alternative fuels. So that might be renewable natural gas, or it could be hydrogen or some other alternative fuel. So it wouldn't necessarily be included here. So there might still be some infrastructure needed to develop those alternative fuels, and that would be incorporated, but not in this place. And so there's still opportunity for that. And the electricity distribution system costs are going to be our proxy value based on historic costs from the EIA. And so we're evaluating how that proxy value could account for higher costs needed to support electrification, adaptation to climate change, and extreme weather. So we're assuming, we've got historical costs, but we'll need to add a bit more to that and create a proxy value. And so we're kind of interested to hear your thoughts about this proxy value as how we can attempt to kind of adjust for those historical costs and reflect the future challenges we're looking at. So please share any questions or comments about transmission and distribution assumptions.
Thank you, Michael. Tucker?
maybe,
Oh,
go ahead.
Edith? No, jump in, Edith.
I was just gonna, I was gonna remind us, sorry, Tucker, we were simultaneous in our timing. I just wanted to note after Tucker asks his question, remind us that Shannon had a question earlier that we said that we would answer when we got to transmission, which, Shannon, maybe you wanna kind of tee up that question again for us after Tucker's asked his question so that we can make sure that we recorded it correctly. I don't wanna misrepresent your question.
Yeah, thank you, Edith. Tucker?
Yeah, just a clarifying piece on this, and I realize that there's a land use group as well that's probably exploring some of this, but on the transmission piece, I guess what is not clear to me is, will the group be that work group, or will the model be recommending potential increases in transmission and policy changes that will be needed to accomplish that in a reasonable amount of time? Or is that just is the model just simply saying, with what we have in anticipated transmission development, this is how we think it impacts the other components to the model?
Yeah, thanks, Tucker.
Yeah, so Tucker, you're right. So the model itself will look at this and basically, I'm making the assumption that it'll show the need for the transmission, but also that's an opportunity. We're going to test the different scenarios. And so if we said a scenario is, constrained transmission within the state, that we would need to get that electricity somewhere else. So we're going to get it out of the state. What does it look like? What do we need? And so all those results in that model would then lead to those policy discussions we're going to have in the first quarter of 2025. And so that would be an opportunity to come back and say, okay, the model is demonstrating these results. What does that mean for policy? Let's have a conversation. What does that look like as far as permanent siting? What kind of recommendations are we comfortable with making around that? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so there will be opportunities to explore, like you said, in 2025 policy changes or recommendations that could potentially make siting of transmission easier, or at least address the challenges around the siting of transmission.
Yeah, and I'm just making the distinction that we're not going to make any policy changes so much as we're going to create
Right.
recommendations
Right.
for the legislature and the governor's office of what we're
Right.
seeing, and they would make those decisions.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. And just getting more clarity, right, that it's kind of two separate processes, right? The modeling and the information that comes out of there and the policy deliberations that we'll be having as a group. So Shannon, just a reminder to jump back in the queue. Scott, I see your hand up. Feel free to jump in, Scott.
Well, thank you. Just curious whether we'll have an opportunity to have Bonneville Power Administration connect in on some of the scenarios that we're talking about, and just to sort of stress test. There's a lot of work going on at BPA right now with regards to regional transmission planning and execution, implementation, the spending and the capital invest efforts, and the operations and maintenance. And there are great opportunities out there with the IIJA and the federal incentives, but I think they're also sort of struggling with how to accommodate some of those federal goals, as well as the ones that are happening regionally. They've got a long queue of folks, who are waiting to interconnect in the system. So they've got a lot of overlay on top of them. It's just, I guess, a way of saying we should find a way to make sure, since that work is going on with, a fleet of probably more than 700 employees in the transmission division at Bonneville, many of them working in the planning function, we should make sure we're testing our scenarios and seeing if they're roughly mapping out to what they're expecting or seeing. Would be an ask. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great flag, Scott. Thank you.
And maybe I can just
then
add,
Alex?
I just want to add, Scott, that we have somebody on the consulting team, Elaine Hart, who's looking at BPA's work right now and evaluating exactly that. So understanding kind of what their analysis is showing, and I think that the work that she's doing will help carry over into also the policy discussions. So just to know that that's something that we're actively working on analyzing.
And we have also had several meetings with BPA.
Good, thank you. And then just IIJA, Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Josh, I see your comment. Are you incorporating deployment, get out of my acronym world, GETs into the transmission inputs, TX inputs? I won't interpret. Do you want to just ask your question out loud, Josh? Thanks.
Yes. So GETs are grid enhancing technologies, which assist with the sort of efficiency and power flow and capacity of the existing transmission network. Some of them are sort of emerging, but a lot of them have been deployed in various regions around the country. And some of them have been deployed in limited ways in Oregon. I'm just wondering if you're incorporating these technologies include things like dynamic line ratings, advanced conductors, advanced power flow controls, and they can really significantly increase the efficiency and capacity of the grid. So wondering if those are being considered.
I believe they are, Josh, but I think to give you a more comprehensive answer, I think we'd have to identify the various different options you just listed. So I think that's something we should probably follow up with our modeler and say, how are these incorporated and at what level? Because I guess I can just generally say, yes, I believe they are, but I think you're looking for more of a specific answer of which ones and at what level. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, that would be great.
Okay, we'll follow up with you on that.
Thanks.
Great, thank you. Thanks for teaching me a shortcut for transmission. I'll keep that in mind. Nate, jump in.
Yeah, just plus one to Josh and Scott's comments, and Scott's comments also raised a question to me. So for modeling purposes, are we just going to focus on the big projects like we have listed here? Because I think to what Scott said, or are we going to dive into more depth onto what BPA is doing on smaller type of projects? That's kind of the question for modeling in this exercise.
Yeah, so I guess I would say at a high level, yes, the model is looking at these larger projects and is making some assumptions around transmission improvements over time, but it's not site-specific identifying individual projects or sites where there should be some transmission development or anything like that. It's just looking at transmission generally. Does that make sense? Like the model is looking at a really kind of high level, macro level.
Yeah. That makes sense. I just wanted to kind of get that clarified. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Thank you. Shannon, not sure if you're out there. I did want to come back to Edith's point earlier. I know you had raised a question that we had put off until this point in time.
Yeah, and I think you could address my question. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks, Edith, for calling that out. Any other questions or comments on the assumptions or any other questions around transmission distribution?
I just want to jump in and point something out. I just have this remaining thought after Nate's comment. So there's a threshold there where we go from transmission down to distribution level, and I just wanted to emphasize that where the model is not taking a detailed look at distribution level, and that's where you see here this bullet on proxy value based on historic costs. So we're looking at the historic costs on the distribution system and then developing a proxy value so that we can build in costs of distribution system kind of development upgrades, et cetera. But just in case your question was crossing over into distribution, I'm not sure that it was, but it was a little unclear. So I wanted to just throw that in there.
Great, thanks, Edith. Then Tim, you had a question. Does the model reflect opportunities for merchant transmission developers?
Yeah, thanks. I'm thinking of the renewable transmission line that is being proposed right now through the Columbia River as a creative option to develop more transmission. But it raises for me a just more general question on whether or not we're thinking a little bit further outside the box of not just utility developed transmission, but any other opportunities for merchant development that may be coming our way.
Well, so I guess I would answer is the model doesn't necessarily make the distinction. So we've got the existing projects we know, and then beyond 2035, I don't think the model makes the distinction of this is like a utility transmission project or this is a merchant project or who's developing it, so much as saying there's a need for transmission. And so I think that'll be an opportunity when we get into those policy conversations to say, okay, the model's saying we need transmission. What's the opportunity to do that? What are the barriers? What are the challenges? Do we need to be more flexible, less flexible? What are the opportunities there? Does that answer your question, Tim?
Generally, yeah. So yeah, we'll see how it goes when we get into the deeper policy discussion.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Tim.
Yeah,
Fred?
thanks.
Yeah, just as we mentioned in our comments, the Columbia River, the renewable transmission project could be completed by 2030, actually, according to what I've heard from them, or somewhere before 2035. So that's just one thing to note. And I would agree, I think we ought to be open, and the model as somebody just mentioned, won't distinguish, what's independent developed or what's a utility developed transmission. I think the difficulty here is figuring out about when do we need it and where can we get it. That's really critical, and it's not. I think we need more discussion of that. I think among those who are involved in transmission.
Thank you, Fred. Nate, I think that's your old hand, right?
You're
Sorry,
right.
on Fred's
Sorry.
Yep, Edith, jump in.
on Fred's comment, I just wanted to make a point that is actually in our charter, not for this group, but for the energy strategy, the overall energy strategy, which is that one of the pieces of strategic value of this exercise is to help inform Oregon's thinking in some of the regional discussions, since it's really a very regional conversation about transmission. Fred, I'm just pointing that out because I think that it reinforces a bit of what you're saying. I mean, there are different levels at which to look at what we need and where we can get it, but I just wanted to
That's
throw
a good
that in
point.
there, remind folks that that's
the other thing to note that we put in our comments is there's a lot of new planning info coming in while this process is going on over the next year plus. Right away, soon, we have the Connected West study, which is sponsored, among others, by the state of Oregon. And we have the first round of the West Tech project coming in by probably late next spring, the new regional west-wide transmission planning. We have the US DOE National Transmission Study coming sometime this fall, I hope. I don't know the exact date because even though I'm on one of the subcommittees. So we have a lot more info coming at us while this process is going on. So one of the trickier aspects is how to incorporate whatever may be available, before you have to close the door on the modeling.
Yeah, and the timing is really the operative thing there. So we are paying attention to those processes, Fred, and I think we're seeing what we can do. But that door will close at some point, and then we'll have to move our discussions into kind of the policy sphere, but still incorporating what we're seeing coming out of those reports. I think that's probably how it's going to have to work out.
Yeah, and that door is going to close this fall. But to add to that, we're not intending the state energy strategy to be a one and done. So we are intending to do it once we recover from doing it again in the 4 to 5 year time frame. So we would incorporate and hone that in, probably not as timely as people would like, but these processes take a lot of effort.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. Laura?
Yeah, I'm glad that others have brought up the regional aspects of this area. And one of the questions that I had was just what assumptions is the model making in terms of connectivity to resources in other states or transmission progress outside of Oregon? And I don't know exactly how you would reflect this in a model, but if we're trying to understand the implications of more coordinated regional planning versus less, is that something we can try to work into the model and its assumptions or not, or to what degree?
Yeah, that's a great question, Laura. So the model is going to look at so we've got the existing transmission that we know that's planned, and then beyond that, we'll start looking at energy development. And so generally, this goes into, we'll have a land use conversation, but generally, we've got some restriction around land use and energy development. And so the model will check and say, okay, is there land? Is there opportunity to develop resources within Oregon? If there is, they'll start developing them, and it'll look at other options if we need additional electricity, which I'm sure we will, how do we get it and from what areas of the state? And we'll look at that regional perspective. And the model takes a look at kind of regional policies, what's going on in Washington, Idaho, California, and the opportunities what's being developed. And so many resources will be, can we get transmission and get electricity from other parts of the state or other resources, other fuels? And so that'll definitely be kind of in that reference case. But then it'll be opportunity for us to like test that and say, okay, let's do a test where we're really constrained on what we can develop within our state. So we're going to be dependent on other states. Where can we get that? What does that look like? And it'll be interesting to look at the cost difference of some of those things, or the challenges of that, or what does that mean as we test those different scenarios. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity within that. Within the model will be really interesting, but then let's look at that model and then we can have those conversations and look at that and look at the cost differences and where the resources would come from in those different scenarios. And what do we think of that? Like, what does that analysis mean to us? What are the policy implications of that? What would we recommend based on that? Does that answer your question, Lauren?
At least partially, yeah. Maybe Fred's gonna jump back in.
Okay, let's go back to you, Fred, and then I think we'll move on. But Laura, let's make sure that your question is fully answered. Fred?
Yeah, a quick question and two quick comments. The question is, and maybe I'm just not paying enough attention, is that Alan just mentioned, modeling wraps up somewhat soon. At what point does the modeling have to really be finished in order to pull together the entire strategy?
Well, we're hoping to start our reference case modeling. They'll start working on it as soon as next week. And then when it will be done, it will be done towards the end of this year. So there'll be modeling versions and we'll work with our contractor and hopefully, we'll look at some draft versions and hopefully we can finalize and then have a final amount of modeling that we can share with this group and share publicly at the end of the year. That would then set us up to have those policy conversations in Q1 of 2025 of saying, okay, here's the modeling results, here's kind of the analysis around it. Now let's get together and have some conversations about it and what do we think based on what we're seeing.
Okay, so that would imply there's not a second round or an adjustment or a kind of update, refresh, whatever you want to call it, based on kind of initial reactions. That there wouldn't be, let's say next spring, another run, a kind of final modeling run. It would all be done at that point. It would all be done by the end of the year.
We are yes, Fred. So we are working towards getting the modeling done at the end of this year. Within this fall, we will try to have some time that we take a look at things and see some initial results and reflect on that. Edith, do you want to jump in? Am I missing any pieces of that timeline?
Yeah, I just want to say that we're running into this, and this is kind of the nature of just having to have a cutoff date at a time, that there's a lot happening. I mean, there are the council is working on kind of how it's framing up its climate assumptions for the 9th power plan, and we would love to have those as well, but that's something that's probably going to come too late. Same with some of these transmission studies. And so that's why I mentioned that there'll be, we are not competing with those transmission studies. We're trying to incorporate kind of a as realistic as possible view of the transmission system across the region in our study. But I think that what we will have to do is just see how we can incorporate any learnings and anything that looks, hopefully nothing is significantly different. But we don't know because those studies haven't come out yet. And so when we have the policy discussions, we'll have to be just really aware of what's coming out and see what we do with it.
So two more quick comments. One is on the not the new wires, the expansion, but rather on reconductoring, et cetera. Just to note, the PGE, actually Warm Springs is the lead on that project along with PGE, the Round Butte to Bethel project. That one's going to happen. It's got DOE funding. It's going to move forward. Big Eddy to Chimala is very much more kind of not sure when and how and where, but BPA seems to be interested in it. But the other issue, and those are, I guess you could argue those are rebuilds, not really reconductoring per se. Reconductoring and other advanced, stuff grid enhancing technologies. This is a big topic right now for everybody. It's also very difficult to pin down what the potential is. And I feel like we didn't really get to talk about that in the one transmission subgroup meeting. So my other thought is, I think it would be really good if that transmission subgroup were reconvened to have a more in-depth conversation about all this stuff, as this new as the modeling gets going, realizing, that's one more thing. And but by the way, the Connected West study will be, as far as I'm remembering, I don't have the exact date, will be out in October, I believe. That one is built off the Nature Conservancy's Power of Place study, which is a very capable West-wide study. It was done a couple of years ago. Has a very, it's the Connected West is built on a kind of a decarbonization pathway inherently, and it also has a very strong component based on the Power of Place study for environmental and land protection. So I think that's a really good one to look at this point. It's also going to be a major input into the way that the West Tech study is being done. And that study will be available within the planning modeling timeframe that we're talking about here. So I think, all these things are swirling around, but like I said, I think it would be helpful to reconvene the transmission subgroup.
Okay, thanks, Fred. And I see that there's a number of comments around Bonneville Power, so we'll hold that for Odo's team to think about how to maximize the liaison. Thank you, Scott, for offering some additional supports to make sure there's a line of sight for some of these conversations going forward. I'm gonna move us. Thank you, Michael, for working through there. If we can go to the next section on electricity generation, Joni.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. So good morning, everyone. Again, this is Joni Slager. I'm the Senior Clean Electricity and Markets Analyst here at Odo. Edith and I led the working group that focused on electricity generation technologies. One of the things in our meeting, you may recall, Evolved presented on how electricity generation is treated in the model. We talked about some of the questions on modeling and data inputs. And of course, the reference scenario we posted online also summarized some of the key data on this topic. We've received a fair amount of written comments. And one of the issues that we've heard back on, where we've heard some conflicting suggestions, is how to deal with the significant uncertainty that is data center load growth. We know this is a significant uncertainty. It's one we raised for discussion in our working group. The way we asked it there was kind of framed in a discussion of whether the uncertainty relative to everything else going on in the economy and the different energy sectors, whether it would make sense for one of the 5 alternative scenarios to consider whether data center load growth is even higher than we expect, to have one forecast in the reference and a higher one in an alternative. And at this point where we are in the process, we don't know yet what the alternative scenarios are going to be. So it's possible an alternative could look at a higher level. It's possible it could look at a lower level of load growth. We don't know yet. We'll be discussing that more in the coming months. It's not point for today, but I did want to give that kind of context on how this all got queued up. As a reminder, what our proposal starting with that we shared was to use the base case forecast out of a study from the Northwest Power and Conservation Council. It's called the Pacific Northwest Power Supply Adequacy Assessment for 2029. It came out last month. I've included here a chart from that report that shows both the base case I mentioned and what they call a mid-higher forecast. And I guess I want to note those are specifically just the demand from tech loads. So this isn't system-wide. But we shared that proposal, and our primary ask for comments was on areas of concern where people thought we should make changes. Most of what we heard back so far either didn't address the specific numbers or forecast here, or we heard some general support for what we were proposing. But we also got comments suggesting that we should use the higher forecast as part of the reference scenario specifically. So this is a place where we've heard 2 different things and both might be reasonable, but we will have to pick one for the model and start inputting that data into the model. So I would really love to hear what this group thinks on whether you think we should stick with that base case scenario that we shared, that line in blue, or if you think that the mid-higher forecast shown in fuchsia might be more appropriate for the reference scenario.
Awesome, thank you, Johnny. So we put the questions pretty clearly to the group, and you can see it on the slide around the base or mid-higher forecasts as a reference be used. So thoughts, reflections, comments? Yeah, Nate.
Just one clarifying, a couple clarifying questions. So, on the proposed reference scenario, is that just Oregon, or is that the whole region in that adequacy assessment?
Hi, Nate.
For the background noise, I don't know if my question came through. Can you hear me?
I can. So
Okay.
you were asking whether the this would be used for the state or the region. It is a region. So the model will be treating Oregon within the context of other states in the Western U.S.
Okay. And were any other models debated in the subgroup, like Peanuts, Forecast, or anybody else? Or was it this one as the base case?
This was the one that was presented. There have been some questions, I think, that have come up that have, I don't know, Edith, if I would invite you to comment on this also, but my understanding is this is, the Power Council has a responsibility to model the region and has had some conversations and utility
Johnny,
is aggregated together.
just really quick, Nate, could you go on mute while Joni's responding here? Thank you. Joni, sorry.
Oh, sorry, Nate. We didn't hear, I think, specific concern with using this forecast. I would start there. But if there are, I think there have been some questions about how it compares. And as I understand it, the one question that has come up is kind of some forecasts that look across multiple utilities can sum up what their forecasts are. And that can be a little of a higher forecast than might actually be realistic. But Edith, I would invite you if you have more you want to add on that point.
I had to unmute. Yeah, thanks. So I think that we're very aware of the Peanut forecast. As I understand it, through the discussions we've had with our modeler, Peanut forecast is more compatible with our model in the way that it's, the council's forecast. This one is more compatible with how the modeling is structured and how we build out the and then kind of and then run the expansion model. So that's why we chose this one, just to give a little bit of background. We did look at both kind of PNUC and their figures and this one here. And this one seemed kind of more closely aligned with how our model is structured. I will add that I'm gonna pose an outstanding question that we need to ask our consultants, and I don't have an answer for you here, and I'm not gonna put them on the spot, but we are going to model Oregon as two zones, east and west, to reflect the transmission constraint of getting power across the Cascades. And we may have the capability to include kind of a constrained transmission scenario, kind of looking across the state. And I mention that because I think that there are some interesting learnings that may come depending on where the data centers end up cited. And something that we haven't gotten to the bottom of, I think that the analysis is still ongoing with our consultants, is, depending on what the more granular assumptions are for where the data centers will be cited. I mean, in some cases we know where things are being cited, and others we don't. That has the potential for some really interesting learnings for Oregon. But again, I'm teeing that more up as something that we're looking at and seeing what we can do, in addition to having this region-wide forecast that we'll incorporate into the model. But I think that, again, because we're modeling the whole region and because there is competition for resources across the region, that this overarching regional number is a really important one to discuss and to get agreement on kind of which way we go in terms of whether we we model in the base reference case or the mid-higher data center case. And there's also a question, there's a scenario that we could do to compare, regardless of which way we go. We could compare a higher or lower. What you compare what we could learn from a higher versus a lower forecast for data center load growth, and that's something that we welcome comments on.
Yeah, and I'll just hit, there's a number of responses in the chat. So Scott, I would advocate for mid-higher because we're not only seeing data center demand in Oregon, but across the West. From Patrick, average the 2 at a minimum. Tucker, I agree with Scott's suggestion. Mid-higher would be more appropriate for our reference. Scott as well, data center load must be taken very seriously because it involves a 24/7 demand, a block of consumption that does not vary widely on a daily basis, but is nonetheless a solid demand profile we can't ignore. And then there's a couple other just clarifying questions. So around just like the comments received, public posting. So I think that our chat, I think the group has committed to documenting the input received. And then Aaron, if East and West Oregon are modeled as separate regions, will all other assumptions be kept consistent between regions? So that's a technical question. And then Nate, I see your hand still up. So can we answer Aaron's question? You got some feedback on the bid?
I just wanted to say thanks for the clarifications on my questions. That all makes sense. I don't have any concerns with the base case study at all either, and I would also vote for the mid to higher as the base case in this modeling.
Great, thank you. So I think that's the majority of the feedback that's come in is moving towards the mid-higher. I guess I would just ask if there's anyone who feels strongly in the opposite direction, maybe to articulate that, or certainly you can share later on. Okay. We got some direction from the group for sure. Any last questions, comments on electricity generation before we move to land?
And I see, I just see a question from Aaron Childs here. If East and West Oregon are modeled as separate regions, will all their assumptions be kept consistent between regions? There is some differentiation happening throughout the model to reflect just kind of structural differences between East and West Oregon. So I wouldn't say that there are going to be kind of static assumptions that are exactly the same between the two, but it would be difficult for me to list them here because it goes beyond a level of detail that I have in my head. But because this is where some of the interesting learnings will be, we will make sure that we communicate those and that we kind of incorporate them into the policy discussions. Because I think that having that East-West transmission, that East-West region for transmission purposes opens up some interesting space for policy discussions and just understanding at a bit more detailed level kind of what the pathways look like for reaching our goals.
Right. Thank you for following up on that. Let's keep moving to land use.
All right, thank you, Ben. So for land use natural resources, so the reference case assumptions, so we evaluated land use resource screens to determine the feasibility where a new and long-lived energy resource could go in Oregon. So how much could be developed, how much we want to develop in Oregon. And it's important to understand with the model, it doesn't cite specific projects and specific locations in Oregon. It's looking at the total availability of land for energy development projects. So this exercise isn't to identify specific locations or sites should be located. Instead, we are determining how much of Oregon is available for energy development as a whole and screen out areas where we're less likely to cite energy development projects. So the model itself is kind of binary. Can it be built or not built? But we certainly recognize within policy, nothing's impossible to be built on for the most part. And so there's always some challenges with that. And so you have to kind of understand the limitations of the model itself. So we evaluated the Nature Conservancy's Power of Place West study and Oregon's Renewable Energy Siting Assessment, so the RESA tool to determine how we could create reasonable land use assumptions. We heard from our working group this was a good way to consider land use for these scenarios, but even better if we can improve upon the data and make it more Oregon specific. And it was also highlighted that some of the assumptions around the kind of the marine environment were limited or not fully comprehensive. So we took a look at that. The staff investigated how we could fully enhance the existing data using kind of new data sources or make it a little bit more Oregon specific. Unfortunately, redoing those data sets was just a little bit too much within the time we had allowed to take too many steps. We are working with our contractor to adjust the marine environment to reflect the Bureau of Ocean BOEM's mapping of potential energy development areas. That's the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, another acronym. And so we are trying to adjust it a little bit as far as those land use screens, but for the most part, we want to use Power Place West level 1 and level 2 categories of exclusion. So these are the legally and administratively protected areas, which kind of aligns with the development we're seeing today. And then within some of our test scenarios that we're looking at, a test scenario that would constrain transmission would provide some of that information around kind of testing a more restrictive land use scenario and give us some valuable information around kind of constrained transmission as well as kind of constraints around like utility scale renewable energy development within the state. And I guess I do want to point out also, as Lauren presented earlier in the equity and environmental justice section, there are kind of limitations within the model around like land use and natural resource data, so that we can't really reflect all the potential energy development impacts to Oregon communities and natural areas, whether that's water use or whether that's kind of the individual impacts to different communities. So the technical analysis of the modeling results and kind of the policy recommendations in the next phase of the energy strategy development will be a better opportunity to kind of dive into those details and present that more and have kind of those more robust conversations of kind of the implications of energy development. So I'd like to pause here and kind of see if you could share with me any kind of your thoughts around this approach.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. So again, a more high level question around comments or questions around the approach to land use. And maybe while people are populating that, there's a couple unanswered questions. So Aaron, your last comment for Edith, additional discussion on East versus West breakdown and locally specific assumptions. So it might be a question around future engagement. There was a question that could be taken offline around the GETs that was still in the hopper. And then of course, this question around approach for land use. So while we're waiting for hands to pop up, Edith, do you want to take the one on kind of future engagement opportunities for kind of the East versus West breakdown?
Yeah, I mean, I will just say that, you know, this is something that we're still working through. So for transmission purposes, you know, we will kind of include some assumptions on east-west transmission capabilities. And we've received some comments on that and we're looking through it. And that's one layer of insights that we will get. And that'll be really important because if we have really constrained east to west transmission capacity, then, you know, what's going to fill the need in the load pockets west of the Cascades. And, you know, that starts to become a really interesting investigation. But there are also things I mentioned today. The climate will be taken into account in the sort of technical operations of heat pumps for space heating, for example. You know, and that's a distinction it's not drawn east to west, but we know that the colder climate zones are to our east. Right, so there'll be some insights there. Similarly, I've heard in the transmission group discussions about vehicle miles traveled, and that more of the opportunities to reduce vehicle miles traveled are in denser population areas. And so again, it's not purely east-west, but there are some significant differences here that do end up kind of having a bit of an east-west split to them. And so we'll be working through that and kind of trying to understand where the learnings are in the model and the opportunities as the modeling is happening. And we'll have to work on how to best structure that conversation with you all. So I just don't have a quick answer. But the answer is that we really want to extract these learnings from the analysis, and we're going to be working really hard to set up the policy discussions and also to set up how we present the findings from the modeling so that we can kind of maximize what we can learn and how we can apply that to the policy discussions. I hope that's a helpful answer, even if it's a bit inconclusive on the next step.
This is great, actually, and maybe I'll just flag that I think this is an area of interest for us from a perspective of both energy production, as well as energy transport, and also energy end use. And so to the extent that we're able to get all three of those components considered here and to have a clearer understanding of the assumptions that are going in, I think that would be really valuable. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin. Thanks, Edith. Laura?
Yeah, just jumping in on the land use and natural resources question. Working for TNC, do obviously feel pretty good about rooting things in the power of place study, but did just want to flag a couple of caveats to that. We had mentioned this in our written comments, but there's a couple places where there's probably better data available now than there was when the power of place study, the Western study, was done. So we had tried to highlight a couple of places where, to the extent there is bandwidth to make a couple of updates, where you might want to spend time on that. And then the other thing I'm just reflecting on, given the ongoing conversation in the rulemaking that DLCD is working on around solar siting, and a lot of conversation about siting on agricultural lands. I'll just note that Power Place West, I believe that the prime farmland exclusion areas are only in siting level 3. And so if we're just using siting level 1 and 2, that's probably not showing any restriction on siting on ag land, which may not be 100% the situation in Oregon today. So I don't have a solution for that, because we also got some feedback that the prime farmland layers used in Power of Place don't map 100% to what would be most accurate locally, but just something to be aware of in interpreting the scenario results.
That's helpful, Laura. Thank you for that. Emily?
Yeah, thanks. This is Emily Griffith with Renewable Northwest. I just wanted to clarify on how land use is being modeled, and the way I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the Power of Place study and ERISA are used to look at restrictions of land that can be used. And so I'm wondering if, like, the different scenarios will be providing a specific range of like acres or hectares or what have you for what is needed to reach our clean energy goals, and if those will be different per scenario, or how that's going to work. Thanks.
Yes, Emily, that's a great question. So yes, I do believe that the model output would show land needing to be dedicated to those resources in different scenarios. Obviously, if there's more utility generation within the state, what would that look like? And if there was less, what would that look like? And where would you have to get it? So I believe that is what we're trying to reach, is that those modeling outputs, but they aren't necessarily a prediction of the future, just something to test against. So I wouldn't necessarily use those exact numbers and say this is the exact amount of land that will be needed in Oregon, so much as it's a frame of reference or something to test against. Does that make sense, Emily?
Yeah, that does. Thank you. And just to follow up on that, something we put in our comments are just to include like the latest studies on energy density for solar and like current industry standards, because those are changing. And maybe to follow up on Laura's point about how like how much land was necessary like a few years ago to reach our standards, that may be less today. Yeah.
That's a great flag, and so we can check with our energy modeler on kind of how they use that, and is that something that changes over time as the improvements around density could be demonstrated. But I'm actually not sure about that, so that's something we can look into.
Can I ask a follow-up question, Emily? Is it and apologies if I missed this in your comments, but are you suggesting a data source with that provides kind of more recent data? You mentioned latest studies on energy density. And Michael, you can just stop me if you already know the answer to this, but I just want to make sure that if Emily, you have a data source that you'd like our modelers to consider, to please share it.
I will. I don't remember it off the top of my head. I was talking with Diane, our legislative director, but I'll get back to you on that. Thanks.
Great.
Awesome.
If I could jump in, I know Joshua in the chat that you mentioned wanting clarity around the grid enhancing technology, and so we will follow up. We'll look into kind of how the model incorporates that at what level, if it does. We just don't know off the top of our head and want to talk directly with Jeremy, our modeler, to get some specifics around that. So we'll follow up on that.
Great, thank you. And then Laura, just seeing, I don't know the assumptions off the top of my head, but believe the Power of Place West did assume increasing energy density over time in the original analysis. But I'm sure to Emily's point, those estimates are always evolving. So I'll just acknowledge, right, that it's not perfect. Any other comments on land use, natural resources? Okay. Well, nice work, all those. I know a lot to move through, and there were some asks, of course, ahead of the meeting, so I appreciate folks' kind of dedication to jumping in and giving some really important insight. If we go next slide, we're going to transition kind of back to a previous conversation around what if scenarios or what if questions that can inform alternative scenarios. So Edith, are you going to kick this off?
Will, thanks, Ben. If we can go to the next slide. So I'm gonna frame this up first by saying that we decided to focus the public comment period on the reference scenario when we started to really feel how short time was, and it was really too much to ask people to comment on a reference scenario and 5 alternative scenarios in one go on a very compressed timeline. So that's why we've been very focused on the reference scenario. But as Alan was pointing out, there's this very fundamental interplay between the scenarios where the real value is of the analysis and how this particular analysis is being structured. And you'll remember those bright yellow deltas that Alan showed on his slide. So just a note on the timing here. We, in our next meeting in October, which we'll talk about next steps soon, but just to tee this up, we will want to speak with you about the alternative scenarios. And by then, we will have provided for public comment 5 alternative scenarios. And we should have received public comment and had an opportunity to take a look at that before we meet next time. So here, what I really would like to do is to provide a glimpse of what we've heard so far and how the questions that we've heard seem to kind of what topics they seem to roll up into, to give a flavor of what these alternative scenarios might look like. So this is really sort of a teaser on where we are and where we could be going. You can see here that we have more than 5 scenarios. So already we have 8 here, or 8 plus. So we have to make some choices. We have a budget for this project. I will say that we're aiming to have the 5 draft scenarios presented for public comment on September 24th. The reason for that is that we have a public webinar on September 24th where we will be presenting the reference scenario and where we landed. And we saw that as a really good opportunity to also, in a public forum, to verbally present the alternative scenarios and also have a link online with written information. So with that lead in, this is really kind of an informed type of slide for now, although we're happy to hear any immediate thoughts that you all have. But we're accepting comments at any point, and we have received, even up until now, quite a few comments on alternative scenarios with ideas, and those are incorporated into this slide, or many of those are incorporated into this slide. So as I mentioned, and as Jillian mentioned, we're seeing that we are reserving 2 scenarios to be counterpoints to the aggressive but achievable levels of electrification and efficiency in the reference. And so the question there will really be how we structure the kind of the boundaries of that scenario. So, so you can see here a more or less energy efficiency in electrification in buildings. We anticipate that it would be a less energy efficiency in electrification in buildings scenario. I could have taken out the more now that we've presented an advanced reference scenario draft. We also anticipate having a constrained transportation electrification scenario. Again, how exactly that looks, you know, which classes of vehicles, kind of which assumptions change for which classes of vehicles, that'll all be really relevant to how that scenario is framed. We've also talked about having I'll call it a sensitivity of constrained vehicle miles traveled, or less constrained vehicles miles traveled, since it looks like, based on comments, the reference scenario would incorporate that 20% VMT reduction by 2050 that we've set for the state. And then we're likely to have a constrained transmission scenario. So just to be clear, that VMT is not one of the 5. It's probably a sub point on those 5. And then we've also heard quite a bit of interest in enhanced alternative fuels, and what a scenario would look like that looks at that that potential future. What if load growth is much faster or greater than expected? Joni sort of teed up this discussion about, you know, regardless of what we pick for the reference, even if we choose that higher load growth, that medium higher load growth trajectory that you saw with the, I don't know, Joni had a really good name for the color. I'll just call it pink, that pink line. She might have said fuchsia, but you know, is that something that we're really interested in seeing, so we can understand the difference in what it takes to meet our energy policy objectives under a higher and lower load growth, particularly from data centers scenario. We've also had a discussion in our last meeting with you all, and in the working groups and listening sessions, we've asked about whether one of the 5 scenarios might look at a higher ambition for decarbonization out to 2050, so that we can learn kind of what more it would take to achieve that. And that's another one that we've heard various comments on, and that we continue to consider, and that we'd be very interested to hear feedback on. And finally, we've heard a number of other ideas here. There are a couple here, but there are many. And I think that one of the criteria that we're using in thinking this through is really, where are the biggest risks and where are the biggest learnings? We don't want to model 2 scenarios that are going to be really similar to each other in terms of what we would be learning, or what differences we would see in the model. And so there's some kind of art and science to defining what these look like. But for now, these are the ones that have where we've heard the most comments. And again, there's more than 5, and so we're really interested in your thoughts, and we will be working to kind of narrow these down and to provide a list of kind of 5 recommended scenarios for feedback, and are going to look forward to your comments on those. So I realize that we're close to time. I'll pause for a second in case anybody has any questions about this piece of our thinking. Again, this is still very much in kind of the draft thinking stage, but we are starting to converge, as you can see, around some particular scenarios, and others are starting to float to the top a bit more than others in terms of importance to people who we've consulted on this through our engagement.
Right. Thanks, Edith. So are you looking for feedback or just clarity in this point? Because this is something we'll come back to.
Well, I think it's more clarity at this point, because we'll present something much more advanced and specific shortly.
Okay, thank you. Scott?
So are you looking for folks' feedback then right now, or that would be helpful?
Well, I think we don't have very much time to have a lot of feedback, and so I think this is more our thought here was just to give you a sneak preview, look under the hood of, like, you know, the engine that's partly constructed right now. But really happy to hear. I mean, your hand is raised. If you have any quick thoughts or just clarifying questions, happy to hear them.
You know, I think the clarifying question, I'll just stick with that, just so we don't open up the Pandora's box of lots of comments, given there's 11 minutes left. But I think just maybe some of them are co-combined in a little bit of a confusing place. Like for instance, the more/less energy efficiency, those are very different scenarios. So I don't know if that's, I know you're not trying to build more scenarios, but I guess to me, I feel like that one might be one where it's probably gonna be more of an interesting exercise for this group to look at less energy efficiency. You always hope for more, right? But scenario planning, I think sometimes you try to, I guess, lean toward the more negative outcome, the one that's harder to achieve, right? Because you then test yourself on the strategies employed that get you somewhere. So, but anyway, I'll hold off, and this is really helpful to have a sneak preview. So thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Scott. Chris? Or Christina?
Sorry. Trying to put a video on for you as well. Scott was maybe getting at my question there, but I was a little confused. Maybe I didn't hear it. Is that more, less? Is that or you can look at one or the other, or is that something that the model can do that it can look at both more and less? So that was my question.
Thank you. And I realized that I should have edited that box before this meeting. So we had framed it as more/less because we hadn't landed yet on the reference case when we showed the slide to the working groups. But I would say I would agree with how Scott framed this actually, and say that the way that we're thinking of it is that the reference case is looking at this aggressive but achievable level of efficiency and electrification. And so the biggest learnings would be in kind of looking at the other side of the coin and understanding if we do a lot less and we rely more on other technologies, what would that look like in terms of cost? What would it look like in terms of co-benefits, and what gets built and where? I hope that helps clarify.
Good, thank you. Jeff, I see your comment mentioning the importance of assumptions on the roles that long-term, mid-term, short-term storage options will play in support of intermittent renewables. Thanks for sharing a link on the long-term storage, and then your work on it. Jeff, why don't you jump in? I'm reading your comment, but you could speak to it.
Sure. Well, there's so many new options out there. Some of them appear quite wacky, and some of them appear more reasonable. And every time I've looked into this, I did a fairly significant literature review 15 months ago, and that's so out of date already because there's just so many new developments. The national labs are involved, the private sector is involved. Department of Energy recognizes the importance of that. So it just seems like a major, I'm not sure what the answer is, but we have to carefully think about storage options, not just long-term, that's the most important, but also midterm and short-term as well, because those will play a significant role, I think, in what will be a viable strategy on what will impact our assumptions on renewable penetration.
Great. Thanks, Josh.
And Jeff, I'll just say we are incorporating different storage technologies in the model. I think that there's probably a question here that I can't answer on the spot about where the line is between what we consider to be technology that's still too early in the development stages to be included and advanced enough. And so there'll be a line there, and I'm not sure how that will compare with the the long duration storage shot, but I know that Jeremy's aware of this effort. So, but I appreciate you bringing it up. It's very important, and I just can't answer that question for you on where the line is on emerging versus kind of existing technologies.
That makes sense. Thanks, Edith.
Yep. Thank you, Jeff. Any other reflections, Shannon, and then Laura?
Hi, thank you. I know that earlier in this process, it was pointed out that none of the modeling scenarios could consider scenarios that aren't consistent with our existing policies. And I just wanted to circle back to that and clarify, is that the case? Did I capture that correctly? And if so, how can we support some of those policy contemplations and um, opportunities if we're not modeling those what ifs? Like, what if there was more expediency in transmission permitting and siting? What if there were different land use constraints? What if are you thinking about that as a future iteration and that this round of modeling is truly constrained by Oregon's existing policies?
I appreciate the question, Shannon. It's a very good one. So I think one important point to make is that we are not modeling. I'll put it differently. Some of the assumptions that we're putting in go beyond what existing policy delivers. And that's sort of necessary because we don't have policies for all of the we don't have all of the policies that we may need to achieve some of the very kind of faster, broader deployment, for example, of key technologies that help us achieve our decarbonization goals. So that's one thing. We're not constraining ourselves to going kind of beyond what existing policies deliver. We're putting in assumptions that may require additional policies to implement them. At the same time, we are building in a constraint that if something is not allowed in Oregon, then we're not offering it up as an option. So we've had quite a bit of discussion around small modular reactors, for example, and we understand why there's a lot of interest in them. That's something that would require a pretty serious change in our laws to enable it to happen, and so we've left it out. So I think that there is quite a lot of space to test alternative features in these alternative scenarios within that framework. But if that's not fully answering your question, Shannon, I'd love to hear where you still have some uncertainty.
No, that's wonderful. That just helps us to be more, provide you with better input and feedback on the alternatives. So thank you. Perfect.
Thanks.
Laura, we only got a couple minutes left, so hopefully it's a relatively succinct question.
Yes. There in the draft reference scenario, there were some questions posed around both the electricity distribution system and pipeline infrastructure cost assumptions. Like, do either of those need kind of additions given what those systems are expected to do? And I'm just curious, is that something that you all landed for the reference scenario, or how might that show up in some of these what if scenarios? And if the answer is just I don't know, let's follow up. That's fine. I'm just curious where that question landed with the public comment.
Michael, do you want to give a quick answer to that?
So, well, Laura, let me make sure I understand the question. So, are you asking like how where we landed on like the proxy value for like the distribution costs?
Yeah, there was that question, and then there was also an open question: should we be considering any other future costs for pipeline infrastructure, such as costs to repurpose pipelines for alternative fuels?
Yeah, I guess I would say we still have those questions open. We haven't landed on a solution. We would really appreciate your feedback. I think somebody mentioned it before that in the transmission distribution working group, some of those things they kind of ran out of time and couldn't really dive into all those things to the degree that they were hoping to. And so we would love any more feedback because I don't want to say it's a real challenge to come up with those costs, and we haven't really figured out where exactly it'll land. And so we're trying to figure it out this week. And so we're kind of coming up against it and trying to figure out if there's some great data sources, especially if we're looking at the distribution cost, that proxy value. How do we, what additional costs are we looking at in the future? Is there a good data set out there? We just don't really know what proxy value. I mean, we can come up with something, and we will, but we'd love to hear from our public partners on some of the recommendations on what that looks like, or what other entities are using when they're looking at those costs. Because it's challenging to figure out the best way to do that.
I might suggest that we move on because we're at time, and I just want to talk about next steps briefly before people have to hop off. Thanks, Michael, for that answer. Can we go to the next slide, please? And the one after that. So, all right, so just a reminder of resources that we have on our webpage. We've updated this to respond to some of the questions on where to find things. Next slide. And so we have here a date for final advisory group comments on the reference scenario. Based on what you heard today, we'd be really happy if you have any additional comments to send in to us, even for those who have sent in comments. We have a meeting scheduled for October 17th. That meeting, as I mentioned already, will be focused on discussing alternative scenarios. And then in November, we'll have a meeting where we're going to have that we'd like to turn to you with those early stage kind of questions about how we build a public engagement process early next year on policy that kind of builds on learnings from this one. I know that this one has had a more compressed timeline, and we're looking forward to having a less compressed timeline when we talk about the policy discussions. And we'll really be looking forward to your thoughts on that. I wanted to add that we'll follow up in writing, but we would really like to see what willingness there would be to have an in-person meeting. This is a really important process, and it's a really important group, and it's difficult to really connect as well virtually when we just meet once a month and see each other in little boxes on the screen. And so we'll reach out to understand your perspectives on the idea of meeting in person, but we, as a starting point, see a lot of value in having an in-person meeting. And having everybody sit around a table. There's something intangible that happens when we meet in person, particularly when there are discussions around difficult issues. And so I might suggest that we consider for that October or November meeting actually meeting in person. And again, we'll follow up to get your views on that. And really appreciate that a lot of comments have come in. A lot of time and thought has gone into the comments that we've received in many cases from you and from others. So thank you for that, and for working with us on this really complicated project and on a timeline that's been quite condensed for this phase of the project.
Perfect. Thank you. We're at 2 minutes over, but appreciate y'all diving in. Start your week right with a 3-hour Monday meeting. So enjoy the rest of the day, rest of the week. Appreciate everyone's effort. Take care.
Thanks.
Thank you all.